Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. Chapter 1. Belgian and Arab. Lieutenant Albert Werper had only the prestige of the name he had dishonored to thank for his narrow escape from being cashiered. At first he had been humbly thankful, too, that they had sent him to this God-forsaken Congo post, instead of court-martialing him, as he had so justly deserved. But now 6 months of the monotony, the frightful isolation, and the loneliness had wrought a change. The young man brooded continually over his fate. His days were filled with morbid self-pity, which eventually engendered in his weak and vacillating mind a hatred for those who had sent him here, for the very men he had at first inwardly thanked for saving him from the ignominy of degradation. He regretted the gay life of Brussels as he never had regretted the sins which had snatched him from that gayest of capitals, and as the days passed he came to centre his resentment upon the representative in Congo land of the authority which had exiled him, his captain and immediate superior. This officer was a cold, taciturn man, inspiring little love in those directly beneath him, yet respected and feared by the black soldiers of his little command. Werper was accustomed to sit for hours glaring at his superior as the two sat upon the veranda of their common quarters, smoking their evening cigarettes in a silence which neither seemed desirous of breaking. The senseless hatred of the lieutenant grew at last into a form of mania. The captain's natural taciturnity he distorted into a studied attempt to insult him because of his past shortcomings. He imagined that his superior held him in contempt, and so he chafed and fumed inwardly until one evening his madness became suddenly homicidal. He fingered the butt of the revolver at his hip, his eyes narrowed and his brows contracted. At last he spoke. "You have insulted me for the last time," he cried, springing to his feet. "I am an officer and a gentleman, and I shall put up with it no longer without an accounting from you, you pig." The captain, an expression of surprise upon his features, turned toward his junior. He had seen men before with the jungle madness upon them, the madness of solitude and unrestrained brooding, and perhaps a touch of fever. He rose and extended his hand to lay it upon the other's shoulder. Quiet words of counsel were upon his lips, but they were never spoken. Werper construed his superior's action into an attempt to close with him. His revolver was on a level with the captain's heart, and the latter had taken but a step when Werper pulled the trigger. Without a moan, the man sank to the rough planking of the veranda, and as he fell, the mists that had clouded Werper's brain lifted, so that he saw himself and the deed that he had done in the same light that those who must judge him would see them. He heard excited exclamations from the quarters of the soldiers, and he heard men running in his direction. They would seize him, and if they didn't kill him, they would take him down the Congo to a point where a properly ordered military tribunal would do so just as effectively, though in a more regular manner. Werper had no desire to die. Never before had he so yearned for life as in this moment that he had so effectively forfeited his right to live. The men were nearing him. What was he to do? He glanced about as though searching for the tangible form of a legitimate excuse for his crime, but he could find only the body of the man he had so causelessly shot down. In despair, he turned and fled from the oncoming soldiery. Across the compound he ran, his revolver still clutched tightly in his hand. At the gates a sentry halted him. Werper did not pause to parley or to exert the influence of his commission. He merely raised his weapon and shot down the innocent black. A moment later, the fugitive had torn open the gates and vanished into the blackness of the jungle, but not before he had transferred the rifle and ammunition belts of the dead sentry to his own person. All that night, Werper fled farther and farther into the heart of the wilderness. Now and again, the voice of a lion brought him to a listening halt, but with cocked and ready rifle he pushed ahead again, more fearful of the human huntsman in his rear than of the wild carnivora ahead. Dawn came at last, but still the man plodded on. All sense of hunger and fatigue were lost in the terrors of contemplated capture. He could think only of escape. He dared not pause to rest or eat until there was no further danger from pursuit, and so he staggered on until at last he fell and could rise no more. How long he had fled he did not know, or try to know. When he could flee no longer, the knowledge that he had reached his limit was hidden from him in the unconsciousness of utter exhaustion. And thus it was that Achmet Zek, the Arab, found him. Achmet's followers were for running a spear through the body of their hereditary enemy, but Achmet would have it otherwise. First he would question the Belgian. It were easier to question a man first and kill him afterward, than kill him first and then question him. So he had Lieutenant Albert Werper carried to his own tent, and there slaves administered wine and food in small quantities until at last the prisoner regained consciousness. As he opened his eyes, he saw the faces of strange black men about him, and just outside the tent, the figure of an Arab. Nowhere was the uniform of his soldiers to be seen. The Arab turned, and seeing the open eyes of the prisoner upon him, entered the tent. "I am Achmet Zek," he announced. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my country? Where are your soldiers?" Achmet Zek. Werper's eyes went wide and his heart sank. He was in the clutches of the most notorious of cutthroats, a hater of all Europeans, especially those who wore the uniform of Belgium. For years the military forces of Belgian Congo had waged a fruitless war upon this man and his followers, a war in which quarter had never been asked nor expected by either side. But presently, in the very hatred of the man for Belgians, Werper saw a faint ray of hope for himself. He, too, was an outcast and an outlaw. So far, at least, they possessed a common interest, and Werper decided to play upon it for all that it might yield. "I have heard of you," he replied, "and was searching for you. My people have turned against me. I hate them. Even now their soldiers are searching for me to kill me. I knew that you would protect me from them, for you too hate them. In return, I will take service with you. I am a trained soldier. I can fight, and your enemies are my enemies." Achmet Zek eyed the European in silence. In his mind he revolved many thoughts, chief among which was that the unbeliever lied. Of course, there was the chance that he did not lie, and if he told the truth, then his proposition was one well worthy of consideration, since fighting men were never over-plentiful, especially white men with the training and knowledge of military matters that a European officer might possess. Achmet Zek scowled, and Werper's heart sank. But Werper did not know Achmet Zek, who was quite apt to scowl where another would smile, and smile where another would scowl. "And if you lied to me," said Achmet Zek, "I will kill you at any time. What return other than your life do you expect for your services?" "My keep only at first. replied Werper. Later, if I am worth more, we can easily reach an understanding. Werper's only desire at the moment was to preserve his life, and so the agreement was reached, and Lieutenant Albert Werper became a member of the ivory and slave raiding band of the notorious Achmet Zeg. For months the renegade Belgian rode with the savage raider. He fought with a savage abandon and a vicious cruelty fully equal to that of his fellow desperadoes. Achmet Zeg watched his recruit with eagle eye, and with a growing satisfaction which finally found expression in a greater confidence in the man, and resulted in an increased independence of action for Werper. Achmet Zeg took the Belgian into his confidence to a great extent, and at last unfolded to him a pet scheme which the Arab had long fostered, but which he never had found an opportunity to effect. With the aid of a European, however, the thing might be easily accomplished. He sounded Werper. "You have heard of the man men called Tarzan?" he asked. Werper nodded. "I have heard of him, but I do not know him." "But for him we might carry on our trading in safety and with great profit," continued the Arab. "For years he has fought us, driving us from the richest part of the country, harassing us, and arming the natives that they may repel us when we come to trade. He is very rich. If we could find some way to make him pay us many pieces of gold, we should not only be avenged upon him, but repaid for much that he has prevented us from winning from the natives under his protection." Werper withdrew a cigarette from a jeweled case and lighted it. "And you have a plan to make him pay?" he asked. "He has a wife," replied Achmet Zeg, "whom men say is very beautiful. She would bring a great price farther north if we found it too difficult to collect ransom money from this Tarzan." Werper bent his head in thought. Achmet Zeg stood awaiting his reply. What good remained in Albert Werper revolted at the thought of selling a white woman into the slavery and degradation of a Muslim harem. He looked up at Achmet Zeg. He saw the Arab's eyes narrow, and he guessed that the other had sensed his antagonism to the plan. What would it mean to Werper to refuse? His life lay in the hands of this semi-barbarian, who esteemed the life of an unbeliever less highly than that of a dog. Werper loved life. What was this woman to him, anyway? She was a European, doubtless, a member of organized society. He was an outcast. The hand of every white man was against him. She was his natural enemy, and if he refused to lend himself to her undoing, Achmet Zeg would have him killed. "You hesitate," murmured the Arab. "I was but weighing the chances of success," lied Werper, "and my reward. As a European I can gain admittance to their home and table. You have no other with you who could do so much. The risk will be great. I should be well paid, Achmet Zeg." A smile of relief passed over the raider's face. "Well said, Werper," and Achmet Zeg slapped his lieutenant upon the shoulder. "You should be well paid, and you shall. Now let us sit together and plan how best the thing may be done." And the two men squatted upon a soft rug beneath the faded silks of Achmet's once gorgeous tent, and talked together in low voices well into the night. Both were tall and bearded, and the exposure to sun and wind had given an almost Arab hue to the European's complexion. In every detail of dress, too, he copied the fashions of his chief, so that outwardly he was as much an Arab as the other. It was late when he arose and retired to his own tent. The following day Werper spent in overhauling his Belgian uniform, removing from it every vestige of evidence that might indicate its military purposes. From a heterogeneous collection of loot, Achmet Zeg procured a pith helmet and a European saddle, and from his black slaves and followers a party of porters, askaris, and tent boys to make up a modest safari for a big game hunter. At the head of this party, Werper set out from camp. Chapter 2. On the road to Opar. It was 2 weeks later that John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, riding in from a tour of inspection of his vast African estate, glimpsed the head of a column of men crossing the plain that lay between his bungalow and the forest to the north and west. He reined in his horse and watched the little party as it emerged from a concealing swale. His keen eyes caught the reflection of the sun upon the white helmet of a mounted man, and with the conviction that a wandering European hunter was seeking his hospitality, he wheeled his mount and rode slowly forward to meet the newcomer. A half-hour later he was mounting the steps leading to the veranda of his bungalow and introducing Monsieur Jules Frécot to Lady Greystoke. "I was completely lost," Monsieur Frécot was explaining. "My head man had never before been in this part of the country, and the guides who were to have accompanied me from the last village we passed knew even less of the country than we. They finally deserted us 2 days since. I am very fortunate indeed to have stumbled so providentially upon succor. I do not know what I should have done had I not found you." It was decided that Frécot and his party should remain several days, or until they were thoroughly rested, when Lord Greystoke would furnish guides to lead them safely back into the country with which Frécot's head man was supposedly familiar. In his guise of a French gentleman of leisure, Werper found little difficulty in deceiving his host and in ingratiating himself with both Tarzan and Jane Clayton. But the longer he remained, the less hopeful he became of an easy accomplishment of his designs. Lady Greystoke never rode alone at any great distance from the bungalow, and the savage loyalty of the ferocious Waziri warriors, who formed a great part of Tarzan's followers, seemed to preclude the possibility of a successful attempt at forcible abduction or of the bribery of the Waziri themselves. A week passed, and Werper was no nearer the fulfillment of his plan, in so far as he could judge, than upon the day of his arrival. But at that very moment something occurred which gave him renewed hope and set his mind upon an even greater reward than a woman's ransom. A runner had arrived at the bungalow with the weekly mail, and Lord Greystoke had spent the afternoon in his study reading and answering letters. At dinner he seemed distraught, and early in the evening he excused himself and retired, Lady Greystoke following him very soon after. Werper, sitting upon the veranda, could hear their voices in earnest discussion, and having realized that something of unusual moment was afoot, he quietly rose from his chair, and keeping well in the shadow of the shrubbery growing profusely about the bungalow, made his silent way to a point beneath the window of the room in which his host and hostess slept. Here he listened, and not without result, for almost the first words he overheard filled him with excitement. Lady Greystoke was speaking as Werper came within hearing. "I always feared for the stability of the company," she was saying, "but it seems incredible that they should have failed for so enormous a sum, unless there has been some dishonest manipulation." "That is what I suspect," replied Tarzan, "but whatever the cause, the fact remains that I have lost everything, and there is nothing for it but to return to Opar and get more." "Oh, John," cried Lady Greystoke, and Werper could feel the shudder through her voice, "is there no other way? I cannot bear to think of you returning to that frightful city. I would rather live in poverty always than to have you risk the hideous dangers of Opar." "You need have no fear," replied Tarzan, laughing. "I am pretty well able to take care of myself, and were I not, the Waziri who will accompany me will see that no harm befalls me." "They ran away from Opar once and left you to your fate," she reminded him. "They will not do it again," he answered. "They were very much ashamed of themselves and were coming back when I met them." "But there must be some other way," insisted the woman. "There is no other way half so easy to obtain another fortune as to go to the treasure vaults of Opar and bring it away," he replied. "I shall be very careful, Jane, and the chances are that the inhabitants of Opar will never know that I have been there again and despoiled them of another portion of the treasure, the very existence of which they are as ignorant of as they would be of its value." The finality in his tone seemed to assure Lady Greystoke that further argument was futile, and so she abandoned the subject. Werper remained listening for a short time, and then, confident that he had overheard all that was necessary and fearing discovery, returned to the veranda, where he smoked numerous cigarettes in rapid succession before retiring. The following morning at breakfast, Werper announced his intention of making an early departure, and asked Tarzan's permission to hunt big game in the Waziri country on his way out, permission which Lord Greystoke readily granted. The Belgian consumed 2 days in completing his preparations, but finally got away with his safari, accompanied by a single Waziri guide whom Lord Greystoke had loaned him. The party made but a single short march when Werper simulated illness and announced his intention of remaining where he was until he had fully recovered. As they had gone but a short distance from the Greystoke bungalow, Werper dismissed the Waziri guide, telling the warrior that he would send for him when he was able to proceed. The Waziri gone, the Belgian summoned one of Achmet Zek's trusted blacks to his tent and dispatched him to watch for the departure of Tarzan, returning immediately to advise Werper of the event and the direction taken by the Englishman. The Belgian did not have to wait long, for the following day his emissary returned with word that Tarzan and a party of 50 Waziri warriors had set out toward the southeast early in the morning. Werper called his headman to him, after writing a long letter to Achmet Zek. This letter he handed to the headman. "Send a runner at once to Achmet Zek with this," he instructed the headman. "Remain here in camp, awaiting further instructions from him or from me. If any come from the bungalow of the Englishman, tell them that I am very ill within my tent and can see no one. Now give me 6 porters and 6 askaris, the strongest and bravest of the safari, and I will march after the Englishman and discover where his gold is hidden." And so it was that as Tarzan, stripped to the loincloth and armed after the primitive fashion he best loved, led his loyal Waziri toward the dead city of Opar, Werper, the renegade, haunted his trail through the long, hot days and camped close behind him by night. And as they marched, Achmet Zek rode with his entire following southward toward the Greystoke farm. To Tarzan of the Apes, the expedition was in the nature of a holiday outing. His civilization was at best an outward veneer which he gladly peeled off with his uncomfortable European clothes whenever any reasonable pretext presented itself. It was a woman's love which kept Tarzan even to the semblance of civilization, a condition for which familiarity had bred contempt. He hated the shams and the hypocrisies of it, and with the clear vision of an unspoiled mind he had penetrated to the rotten core of the heart of the thing, the cowardly greed for peace and ease, and the safeguarding of property rights. That the fine things of life, art, music, and literature, had thriven upon him such enervating ideals, he strenuously denied, insisting rather that they had endured in spite of civilization. "Show me the fat, opulent coward," he was wont to say, "whoever originated a beautiful ideal. in the clash of arms, in the battle for survival, amid hunger and death and danger, in the face of God as manifested in the display of nature's most terrific forces, is born all that is finest and best in the human heart and mind. And so Tarzan always came back to nature in the spirit of a lover keeping a long-deferred tryst after a period behind prison walls. His Waziri at Marrow were more civilized than he. They cooked their meat before they ate it, and they shunned many articles of food as unclean that Tarzan had eaten with gusto all his life, and so insidious is the virus of hypocrisy that even the stalwart ape-man hesitated to give rein to his natural longings before them. He ate burnt flesh when he would have preferred it raw and unspoiled, and he brought down game with arrow or spear when he would far rather have leapt upon it from ambush and sunk his strong teeth in its jugular. But at last the call of the milk of the savage mother that had suckled him in infancy rose to an insistent demand. He craved the hot blood of a fresh kill, and his muscles yearned to pit themselves against the savage jungle in the battle for existence that had been his sole birthright for the first 20 years of his life. Chapter 3. The Call of the Jungle. Moved by these vague yet all-powerful urgings, the ape-man lay awake one night in the little thorn boma that protected, in a way, his party from the depredations of the great carnivora of the jungle. A single warrior stood sleepy guard beside the fire that yellow eyes out of the darkness beyond the camp made imperative. The moans and the coughing of the big cats mingled with the myriad noises of the lesser denizens of the jungle to fan the savage flame in the breast of this savage English lord. He tossed upon his bed of grasses, sleepless, for an hour, and then he rose, noiseless as a wraith, and while the Waziri's back was turned, vaulted the boma wall in the face of the flaming eyes, swung silently into a great tree, and was gone. For a time, in sheer exuberance of animal spirit, he raced swiftly through the middle terrace, swinging perilously across wide spans from one jungle giant to the next, and then he clambered upward to the swaying, lesser boughs of the upper terrace where the moon shone full upon him, and the air was stirred by little breezes, and death lurked ready in each frail branch. Here he paused and raised his face to Goro, the moon. With uplifted arm he stood, the cry of the bull-ape quivering upon his lips. Yet he remained silent, lest he arouse his faithful Waziri, who were all too familiar with the hideous challenge of their master. And then he went on more slowly and with greater stealth and caution, for now Tarzan of the Apes was seeking a kill. Down to the ground he came in the utter blackness of the close-set boles and the overhanging verdure of the jungle. He stooped from time to time and put his nose close to earth. He sought and found a wide game trail, and at last his nostrils were rewarded with the scent of the fresh spoor of Bara, the deer. Tarzan's mouth watered, and a low growl escaped his patrician lips. Sloughed from him was the last vestige of artificial caste. Once again he was the primeval hunter, the first man, the highest caste type of the human race. Upwind he followed the elusive spoor with a sense of perception so transcending that of ordinary man as to be inconceivable to us. Through countercurrents of the heavy stench of meat-eaters he traced the trail of Bara. The sweet and cloying stink of Horta the boar could not drown his quarry's scent, the permeating mellow musk of the deer's foot. Presently the body scent of the deer told Tarzan that his prey was close at hand. It sent him into the trees again, into the lower terrace where he could watch the ground below and catch with ears and nose the first intimation of actual contact with his quarry. Nor was it long before the ape-man came upon Bara standing alert at the edge of a moon-bathed clearing. Noiselessly, Tarzan crept through the trees until he was directly over the deer. In the ape-man's right hand was the long hunting knife of his father, and in his heart the bloodlust of the carnivore. Just for an instant he poised above the unsuspecting batter, and then he launched himself downward upon the sleek back. The impact of his weight carried the deer to its knees, and before the animal could regain its feet, the knife had found its heart. As Tarzan rose upon the body of his kill to scream forth his hideous victory cry into the face of the moon, the wind carried to his nostrils something which froze him to statuesque immobility and silence. His savage eyes blazed in the direction from which the wind had borne down the warning to him, and a moment later the grasses at one side of the clearing parted, and Numa, the lion, strode majestically into view. His yellow-green eyes were fastened upon Tarzan as he halted just within the clearing and glared enviously at the successful hunter, for Numa had had no luck this night. From the lips of the ape-man broke a rumbling growl of warning. Numa answered, but he did not advance. Instead he stood, waving his tail gently to and fro, and presently Tarzan squatted upon his kill and cut a generous portion from a hind quarter. Numa eyed him with growing resentment and rage as, between mouthfuls, the ape-man growled out his savage warnings. Now this particular lion had never before come in contact with Tarzan of the Apes, and he was much mystified. Here was the appearance and the scent of a man-thing, and Numa had tasted of human flesh and learned that though not the most palatable, it was certainly by far the easiest to secure. Yet there was that in the bestial growls of the strange creature which reminded him of formidable antagonists and gave him pause, while his hunger and the odor of the hot flesh of Bara goaded him almost to madness. Always Tarzan watched him, guessing what was passing in the little brain of the carnivore, and well it was that he did watch him, for at last Numa could stand it no longer. His tail shot suddenly erect, and at the same instant the wary ape-man, knowing all too well what the signal portended, grasped the remainder of the deer's hind quarter between his teeth and leapt into a nearby tree as Numa charged him with all the speed and a sufficient semblance of the weight of an express train. Tarzan's retreat was no indication that he felt fear. Jungle life is ordered along different lines than ours, and different standards prevail. Had Tarzan been famished, he would, doubtless, have stood his ground and met the lion's charge. He had done the thing before upon more than one occasion, just as in the past he had charged lions himself. But tonight he was far from famished, and in the hind quarter he had carried off with him was more raw flesh than he could eat. Yet it was with no equanimity that he looked down upon Numa rending the flesh of Tarzan's kill. The presumption of this strange Numa must be punished, and forthwith Tarzan set out to make life miserable for the big cat. Close by were many trees bearing large, hard fruits, and to one of these the ape-man swung with the agility of a squirrel. Then commenced a bombardment which brought forth earth-shaking noises from Numa. One after another, as rapidly as he could gather and hurl them, Tarzan pelted the hard fruit down upon the lion. It was impossible for the tawny cat to eat under that hail of missiles. He could but roar and growl and dodge, and eventually he was driven away entirely from the carcass of Bara, the deer. He went roaring and resentful, but in the very center of the clearing his voice was suddenly hushed, and Tarzan saw the great head lower and flatten out, the body crouch and the long tail quiver, as the beast slunk cautiously toward the trees upon the opposite side. Immediately Tarzan was alert. He lifted his head and sniffed the slow jungle breeze. What was it that had attracted Numa's attention and taken him soft-footed and silent away from the scene of his discomfiture? Just as the lion disappeared among the trees beyond the clearing, Tarzan caught upon the downcoming wind the explanation of his new interest. The scent spoor of man was wafted strongly to the sensitive nostrils. Caching the remainder of the deer's hind quarter in the crotch of a tree, the ape-man wiped his greasy palms upon his naked thighs and swung off in pursuit of Numa. A broad, well-beaten elephant path led into the forest from the clearing. Parallel to this slunk Numa, while above him Tarzan moved through the trees, the shadow of a wraith. The savage cat and the savage man saw Numa's quarry almost simultaneously, though both had known before it came within the vision of their eyes that it was a black man. Their sensitive nostrils had told them this much, and Tarzan's had told him that the scent spoor was that of a stranger. Old and a male, for race and sex and age each has its own distinctive scent. It was an old man that made his way alone through the gloomy jungle, a wrinkled, dried-up, little old man, hideously scarred and tattooed and strangely garbed, with the skin of a hyena about his shoulders and the dried head mounted upon his grey pate. Tarzan recognized the earmarks of the witch-doctor and awaited Numa's charge with a feeling of pleasurable anticipation. For the ape-man had no love for witch-doctors, but in the instant that Numa did charge, the white man suddenly recalled that the lion had stolen his kill a few minutes before, and that revenge is sweet. The first intimation the black man had that he was in danger was the crash of twigs as Numa charged through the bushes into the game trail not 20 yards behind him. Then he turned to see a huge, black-maned lion racing towards him. Even as he turned, Numa seized him. At the same instant, the ape-man dropped from an overhanging limb full upon the lion's back, and as he alighted, he plunged his knife into the tawny side, behind the left shoulder, tangled the fingers of his right hand in the long mane, buried his teeth in Numa's neck, and wound his powerful legs about the beast's torso. With a roar of pain and rage, Numa reared up and fell backward upon the ape, but still the mighty man-thing clung to his hold, and repeatedly the long knife plunged rapidly into his side. Over and over rolled Numa the lion, clawing and biting at the air, roaring and growling horribly in savage attempt to reach the thing upon its back. More than once was Tarzan almost brushed from his hold. He was battered and bruised and covered with blood from Numa and dirt from the trail, yet not for an instant did he lessen the ferocity of his mad attack, nor his grim hold upon the back of his antagonist. To have loosened for an instant his grip there would have been to bring him within reach of those tearing talons or rending fangs, and have ended forever the grim career of this jungle-bred English lord. Where he had fallen beneath the spring of the lion, the witch-doctor lay, torn and bleeding, unable to drag himself away, and watched the terrific battle between these two lords of the jungle. His sunken eyes glittered, and his wrinkled lips moved over toothless gums as he mumbled weird incantations to the demons of his cult. For a time he felt no doubt as to the outcome. The strange white man must certainly succumb to terrible Simba. Who ever heard of a lone man armed only with a knife slaying so mighty a beast? Yet presently the old black man's eyes went wider, and he commenced to have his doubts and misgivings. What wonderful sort of creature was this that battled with Simba and held his own despite the mighty muscles of the king of beasts? And slowly there dawned in those sunken eyes, gleaming so brightly from the scarred and wrinkled face, the light of a dawning recollection. Gropingly backward into the past reached the fingers of memory, until at last they seized upon a faint picture, faded and yellow with the passing years. It was the picture of a lithe, white-skinned youth swinging through the trees in company with a band of huge apes, and the old eyes blinked and a great fear came into them, the superstitious fear of one who believes in ghosts and spirits and demons. And came the time once more when the witch-doctor no longer doubted the outcome of the duel. Yet his first judgment was reversed, for now he knew that the jungle god would slay Simba, and the old black was even more terrified of his own impending fate at the hands of the victor than he had been by the sure and sudden death which the triumphant lion would have meted out to him. He saw the lion weaken from loss of blood. He saw the mighty limbs tremble and stagger, and at last he saw the beast sink down to rise no more. He saw the forest god or demon rise from the vanquished foe, and placing a foot upon the still quivering carcass, raise his face to the moon, and bay out a hideous cry that froze the ebbing blood in the veins of the witch-doctor. Chapter 4. Prophecy and Fulfillment. Then Tarzan turned his attention to the man. He had not slain Numa to save the Negro. He had merely done it in revenge upon the lion. But now that he saw the old man lying helpless and dying before him, something akin to pity touched his savage heart. In his youth he would have slain the witch-doctor without the slightest compunction. But civilization had had its softening effect upon him, even as it does upon the nations and races which it touches, though it had not yet gone far enough with Tarzan to render him either cowardly or effeminate. He saw an old man suffering and dying, and he stooped and felt of his wounds and stenched the flow of blood. "Who are you?" asked the old man in a trembling voice. "I am Tarzan, Tarzan of the Apes," replied the ape-man, and not without a greater touch of pride than he would have said, "I am John Clayton, Lord Greystoke." The witch-doctor shook convulsively and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was in them a resignation to whatever horrible fate awaited him at the hands of this feared demon of the woods. "Why did you not kill me?" he asked. "Why should I kill you?" inquired Tarzan. "You have not harmed me, and anyway, you are already dying. Numa the lion has killed you." "You would not kill me?" Surprise and incredulity were in the tones of the quavering old voice. "I would save you if I could," replied Tarzan, "but that cannot be done. Why do you think I would kill you?" For a moment the old man was silent. When he spoke, it was evidently after some little effort to muster his courage. "I know you of old," he said, "when you ranged the jungle in the country of Monga, the chief. I was already a witch-doctor when you slew Kulonga and the others, and when you robbed our huts and our poison pot. At first I did not remember you, but at last I did. The white-skinned ape that lived with the hairy apes and made life miserable in the village of Mbonga the chief, the forest god, the Munango Kiwati, for whom we set food outside our gates and who came and ate it. Tell me before I die, are you man or devil?" Tarzan laughed. "I am a man," he said. The old fellow sighed and shook his head. "You have tried to save me from Simba," he said. "For that I shall reward you. I am a great witch-doctor. Listen to me, white man. I see bad days ahead of you. It is writ in my own blood which I have smeared upon my palm. A god greater even than you will rise up and strike you down. Turn back, Munango Kiwati. Turn back before it is too late. Danger lies ahead of you and danger lurks behind, but greater is the danger before. I see." He paused and drew a long, gasping breath. Then he crumpled into a little wrinkled heap and died. Tarzan wondered what else he had seen. It was very late when the ape-man re-entered the boma and lay down among his black warriors. None had seen him go, and none saw him return. He thought about the warning of the old witch doctor before he fell asleep, and he thought of it again after he awoke. But he did not turn back, for he was unafraid, though had he known what lay in store for one he loved most in all the world, he would have flown through the trees to her side and allowed the gold of Opar to remain forever hidden in its forgotten storehouse. Behind him that morning, another white man pondered something he had heard during the night, and very nearly did he give up his project and turn back upon his trail. It was Werper, the murderer, who in the still of the night had heard far away upon the trail ahead of him a sound that had filled his cowardly soul with terror, a sound such as he never before had heard in all his life, nor dreamed that such a frightful thing could emanate from the lungs of a God-created creature. He had heard the victory cry of the bull-ape as Tarzan had screamed it forth into the face of Goro, the moon, and he had trembled then and hidden his face. And now, in the broad light of a new day, he trembled again as he recalled it, and would have turned back from the nameless danger the echo of that frightful sound seemed to portend, had he not stood in even greater fear of Achmet Zek, his master. And so Tarzan of the Apes forged steadily ahead toward Opar's ruined ramparts, and behind him slunk Werper, jackal-like, and only God knew what lay in store for each. At the edge of the desolate valley, overlooking the golden domes and minarets of Opar, Tarzan halted. By night he would go alone to the treasure vault, reconnoitering, for he had determined that caution should mark his every move upon this expedition. With the coming of night he set forth, and Werper, who had scaled the cliffs alone behind the ape-man's party, and hidden through the day among the rough boulders of the mountain top, slunk stealthily after him. The boulder-strewn plain between the valley's edge and the mighty granite kopje, outside the city's walls, where lay the entrance to the passageway leading to the treasure vault, gave the Belgian ample cover as he followed Tarzan toward Opar. He saw the giant ape-man swing himself nimbly up the face of the great rock. Werper, clawing fearfully during the perilous ascent, sweating in terror, almost palsied by fear, but spurred on by avarice, following upward, until at last he stood upon the summit of the rocky hill. Tarzan was nowhere in sight. For a time Werper hid behind one of the lesser boulders that were scattered over the top of the hill, but seeing or hearing nothing of the Englishman, he crept from his place of concealment to undertake a systematic search of his surroundings, in hope that he might discover the location of the treasure in ample time to make his escape before Tarzan returned. For it was the Belgian's desire merely to locate the gold that, after Tarzan had departed, he might come in safety with his followers and carry away as much as he could transport. He found the narrow cleft leading downward into the heart of the kopje along well-worn granite steps. He advanced quite to the dark mouth of the tunnel into which the runway disappeared. But here he halted, fearing to enter, lest he meet Tarzan returning. The ape-man, far ahead of him, groped his way along the rocky passage until he came to the ancient wooden door. A moment later he stood within the treasure chamber where, ages since, long-dead hands had ranged the lofty rows of precious ingots for the rulers of the great continent which now lies submerged beneath the waters of the Atlantic. No sound broke the stillness of the subterranean vault. There was no evidence that another had discovered the forgotten wealth since last the ape-man had visited its hiding place. Satisfied, Tarzan turned and retraced his steps toward the summit of the kopje. Werper, from the concealment of a jutting granite shoulder, watched him pass up from the shadows of the stairway and advance toward the edge of the hill which faced the rim of the valley where the Waziri awaited the signal of their master. Then Werper, slipping stealthily from his hiding place, dropped into the somber darkness of the entrance and disappeared. Tarzan, halting upon the copier's edge, raised his voice in the thunderous roar of a lion. Twice, at regular intervals, he repeated the call, standing in attentive silence for several minutes after the echoes of the third call had died away. And then, from far across the valley, faintly came an answering roar. Once, twice, thrice. Bazuli, the Waziri chieftain, had heard and replied. Tarzan again made his way toward the treasure vault, knowing that in a few hours his blacks would be with him, ready to bear away another fortune in the strangely shaped golden ingots of Opar. In the meantime, he would carry as much of the precious metal to the summit of the copier as he could. 6 trips he made in the 5 hours before Bazuli reached the copier, and at the end of that time he had transported 48 ingots to the edge of the great boulder, carrying upon each trip a load which might well have staggered 2 ordinary men. Yet his giant frame showed no evidence of fatigue, as he helped to raise his ebon warriors to the hilltop with the rope that had been brought for the purpose. 6 times he had returned to the treasure chamber, and 6 times Werper the Belgian had cowered in the black shadows at the far end of the long vault. Once again came the ape-man, and this time there came with him 50 fighting men, turning porters for love of the only creature in the world who might command of their fierce and haughty natures such menial service. 52 more ingots passed out of the vaults, making the total of 100 which Tarzan intended taking away with him. As the last of the Waziri filed from the chamber, Tarzan turned back for a last glimpse of the fabulous wealth upon which his 2 inroads had made no appreciable impression. Before he extinguished the single candle he had brought with him for the purpose, and the flickering light of which had cast the first alleviating rays into the impenetrable darkness of the buried chamber that it had known for the countless ages since it had lain forgotten of man, Tarzan's mind reverted to that first occasion upon which he had entered the treasure vault, coming upon it by chance as he fled from the pits beneath the temple, where it had been hidden by La, the high priestess of the sun-worshippers. He recalled the scene within the temple when he had lain stretched upon the sacrificial altar, while La, with high-raised dagger, stood above him, and the rows of priests and priestesses awaited, in the ecstatic hysteria of fanaticism, the first gush of their victims' warm blood, that they might fill their golden goblets and drink to the glory of their flaming god. The brutal and bloody interruption by Thar, the mad priest, passed vividly before the ape-man's recollective eyes. The flight of the votaries before the insane blood-lust of the hideous creature, the brutal attack upon La, and his own part of the grim tragedy when he had battled with the infuriated Oparian and left him dead at the feet of the priestess he would have profaned. This and much more passed through Tarzan's memory as he stood gazing at the long tiers of dull yellow metal. He wondered if La still ruled the temples of the ruined city whose crumbling walls rose upon the very foundations about him. Had she finally been forced into a union with one of her grotesque priests? It seemed a hideous fate indeed for one so beautiful. With a shake of his head, Tarzan stepped to the flickering candle, extinguished its feeble rays, and turned toward the exit. Behind him the spy waited for him to be gone. He had learned the secret for which he had come, and now he could return at his leisure to his waiting followers, bring them to the treasure vault, and carry away all the gold that they could stagger under. The Waziri had reached the outer end of the tunnel, and were winding upward toward the fresh air and the welcome starlight of the copier's summit, before Tarzan shook off the detaining hand of reverie and started slowly after them. Once again, and, he thought, for the last time, he closed the massive door of the treasure room. In the darkness behind him, Werper rose and stretched his cramped muscles. He stretched forth a hand and lovingly caressed a golden ingot on the nearest tier. He raised it from its immemorial resting place and weighed it in his hands. He clutched it to his bosom in an ecstasy of avarice. Tarzan dreamed of the happy homecoming which lay before him, of dear arms about his neck and a soft cheek pressed to his. But there rose to dispel that dream the memory of the old witch-doctor and his warning. And then, in the span of a few brief seconds, the hopes of both these men were shattered. The one forgot even his greed in the panic of terror. The other was plunged into total forgetfulness of the past by a jagged fragment of rock which gashed a deep cut upon his head. Chapter 5. The Altar of the Flaming God. It was at the moment that Tarzan turned from the closed door to pursue his way to the outer world. The thing came without warning. One instant all was quiet and stability. The next, and the world rocked. The tortured sides of the narrow passageway split and crumbled. Great blocks of granite, dislodged from the ceiling, tumbled into the narrow way, choking it, and the walls bent inward upon the wreckage. Beneath the blow of a fragment of the roof, Tarzan staggered back against the door to the treasure room. His weight pushed it open, and his body rolled inward upon the floor. In the great apartment where the treasure lay, less damage was wrought by the earthquake. A few ingots toppled from the higher tiers, a single piece of the rocky ceiling splintered off and crashed downward to the floor, and the walls cracked, though they did not collapse. There was but the single shock. No other followed to complete the damage undertaken by the first. Werper, thrown to his length by the suddenness and violence of the disturbance, staggered to his feet when he found himself unhurt. Groping his way toward the far end of the chamber, he sought the candle which Tarzan had left stuck in its own wax upon the protruding end of an ingot. By striking numerous matches, the Belgian at last found what he sought, and when, a moment later, the sickly rays relieved the Stygian darkness about him, he breathed a nervous sigh of relief, for the impenetrable gloom had accentuated the terrors of his situation. As they became accustomed to the light, the man turned his eye toward the door. His one thought now was of escape from this frightful tomb, and as he did so he saw the body of the naked giant lying stretched upon the floor just within the doorway. Werper drew back in sudden fear of detection, but a second glance convinced him that the Englishman was dead. From a great gash in the man's head, a pool of blood had collected upon the concrete floor. Quickly, the Belgian leapt over the prostrate form of his erstwhile host, and without a thought of succor for the man in whom, for aught he knew, life still remained, he bolted for the passageway and safety. But his renewed hopes were soon dashed. Just beyond the doorway he found the passage completely clogged and choked by impenetrable masses of shattered rock. Once more he turned and re-entered the treasure vault. Taking the candle from its place, he commenced a systematic search of the apartment. Nor had he gone far before he discovered another door in the opposite end of the room, a door which gave upon creaking hinges to the weight of his body. Beyond the door lay another narrow passageway. Along this Werper made his way, ascending a flight of stone steps to another corridor 20 feet above the level of the first. The flickering candle lighted the way before him, and a moment later he was thankful for the possession of this crude and antiquated luminant, which, a few hours before, he might have looked upon with contempt, for it showed him, just in time, a yawning pit, apparently terminating the tunnel he was traversing. Before him was a circular shaft. He held the candle above it and peered downward. Below him, at a great distance, he saw the light reflected back from the surface of a pool of water. He had come upon a well. He raised the candle above his head and peered across the black void, and there upon the opposite side he saw the continuation of the tunnel. But how was he to span the gulf? As he stood there measuring the distance to the opposite side and wondering if he dared venture so great a leap, there broke suddenly upon his startled ears a piercing scream, which diminished gradually until it ended in a series of dismal moans. The voice seemed partly human, yet so hideous that it might well have emanated from the tortured throat of a lost soul writhing in the fires of hell. The Belgian shuddered and looked fearfully upward, for the scream had seemed to come from above him. As he looked, he saw an opening far overhead and a patch of sky pinked with brilliant stars. His half-formed intention to call for help was expunged by the terrifying cry. Where such a voice lived, no human creatures could dwell. He dared not reveal himself to whatever inhabitants dwelt in the place above him. He cursed himself for a fool that he had ever embarked upon such a mission. He wished himself safely back in the camp of Achmet Zek, and would almost have embraced an opportunity to give himself up to the military authorities of the Congo, if by so doing he might be rescued from the frightful predicament in which he now was. He listened fearfully, but the cry was not repeated, and at last, spurred to desperate means, he gathered himself for the leap across the chasm. Going back 20 paces, he took a running start, and at the edge of the well leapt upward and outward in an attempt to gain the opposite side. In his hand he clutched the sputtering candle, and as he took the leap the rush of air extinguished it. In utter darkness he flew through space, clutching outward for a hold should his feet miss the invisible ledge. He struck the edge of the door of the opposite terminus of the rocky tunnel with his knees, slipped backward, clutched desperately for a moment, and at last hung half within and half without the opening. But he was safe. For several minutes he dared not move, but clung, weak and sweating, where he lay. At last, cautiously, he drew himself well within the tunnel, and again he lay at full length upon the floor, fighting to regain control of his shattered nerves. When his knees struck the edge of the tunnel, he had dropped the candle. Presently, hoping against hope that it had fallen upon the floor of the passageway, rather than back into the depths of the well, he rose upon all fours and commenced a diligent search for the little tallow cylinder, which now seemed infinitely more precious to him than all the fabulous wealth of the hoarded ingots of Opar. And when at last he found it, he clasped it to him and sank back, sobbing and exhausted. For many minutes he lay trembling and broken, but finally he drew himself to a sitting posture, and taking a match from his pocket, lighted the stump of the candle which remained to him. With the light he found it easier to regain control of his nerves, and presently he was again making his way along the tunnel in search of an avenue of escape. The horrid cry that had come down to him from above through the ancient well shaft still haunted him, so that he trembled in terror at even the sounds of his own cautious advance. He had gone forward but a short distance, when, to his chagrin, a wall of masonry barred his farther progress, closing the tunnel completely from top to bottom and from side to side. What could it mean? Werper was an educated and intelligent man. His military training had taught him to use his mind for the purpose for which it was intended. A blind tunnel such as this was senseless. It must continue beyond the wall. Someone at some time in the past had had it blocked for an unknown purpose of his own. The man fell to examining the masonry by the light of his candle. To his delight, he discovered that the thin blocks of hewn stone of which it was constructed were fitted in loosely, without mortar or cement. He tugged upon one of them, and to his joy found that it was easily removable. One after another he pulled out the blocks until he had opened an aperture large enough to admit his body. Then he crawled through into a large, low chamber. Across this, another door barred his way, but this too gave before his efforts, for it was not barred. A long, dark corridor showed before him, but before he had followed it far, his candle burned down until it scorched his fingers. With an oath, he dropped it to the floor, where it sputtered for a moment and went out. Now he was in total darkness, and again terror rode heavily astride his neck. What further pitfalls and dangers lay ahead he could not guess, but that he was as far as ever from liberty he was quite willing to believe, so depressing is utter absence of light to one in unfamiliar surroundings. Slowly he groped his way along, feeling with his hands upon the tunnel's walls, and cautiously with his feet ahead of him upon the floor before he could take a single forward step. How long he crept on thus he could not guess, but at last, feeling that the tunnel's length was interminable, and exhausted by his efforts, by terror and loss of sleep, he determined to lie down and rest before proceeding further. When he awoke, there was no change in the surrounding blackness. He might have slept a second or a day, he could not know, but that he had slept for some time was attested by the fact that he felt refreshed and hungry. Again he commenced his groping advance, but this time he had gone but a short distance when he emerged into a room which was lighted through an opening in the ceiling, from which a flight of concrete steps led downward to the floor of the chamber. Above him, through the aperture, Werper could see sunlight lancing from massive columns which were twined about by clinging vines. He listened, but he heard no sound other than the soughing of the wind through leafy branches, the hoarse cries of birds, and the chattering of monkeys. Boldly he ascended the stairway, to find himself in a circular court. Just before him stood a stone altar, stained with rusty brown discolorations. At the time, Werper gave no thought to an explanation of these stains. Later, their origin became all too hideously apparent to him. Beside the opening in the floor, just behind the altar, through which he had entered the court from the subterranean chamber below, the Belgian discovered several doors leading from the enclosure upon the level of the floor. Above and circling the courtyard was a series of open balconies. Monkeys scampered about the deserted ruins, and gaily plumaged birds flitted in and out among the column and the galleries far above, but no sign of human presence was discernible. Werper felt relieved. He sighed as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He took a step toward one of the exits, and then he halted wide-eyed in astonishment and terror. For almost at the same instant a dozen doors opened in the courtyard wall, and a horde of frightful men rushed in upon him. They were the priests of the flaming god of Opar, the same shaggy, knotted, hideous little men who had dragged Jane Clayton to the sacrificial altar at this very spot years before. Their long arms, their short and crooked legs, their close-set evil eyes, and their low, receding foreheads gave them a bestial appearance that sent a qualm of paralyzing fright through the shaken nerves of the Belgian. With a scream, he turned to flee back into the lesser terrors of the gloomy corridors and apartments from which he had just emerged. But the frightful men anticipated his intentions. They blocked the way, they seized him, and though he fell, grovelling upon his knees before them, begging for his life, they bound him and hurled him to the floor of the inner temple. The rest was but a repetition of what Tarzan and Jane Clayton had passed through. The priestesses came, and with them La, the high priestess. Werper was raised and laid across the altar. Cold sweat exuded from his every pore as La raised the cruel sacrificial knife above him. The death chant fell upon his tortured ears. His staring eyes wandered to the golden goblets from which the hideous votaries would soon quench their inhuman thirst in his own warm life-blood. He wished that he might be granted the brief respite of unconsciousness before the final plunge of the keen blade, and then there was a frightful roar that sounded almost in his ears. The high priestess lowered her dagger. Her eyes went wide in horror. The priestesses, her votaresses, screamed and fled madly toward the exits. The priests roared out their rage and terror according to the temper of their courage. Werper strained his neck about to catch a sight of the cause of their panic, and when, at last, he saw it, he too went cold in dread, for what his eyes beheld was the figure of a huge lion standing in the center of the temple, and already a single victim lay mangled beneath his cruel paws. Again the Lord of the Wilderness roared, turning his baleful gaze upon the altar. La staggered forward, reeled, and fell across Werper in a swoon. Chapter 6. The Arab Raid. After their first terror had subsided, subsequent to the shock of the earthquake, Bazuli and his warriors hastened back into the passageway in search of Tarzan and 2 of their own number who were also missing. They found the way blocked by jammed and distorted rock. For 2 days they labored to tear a way through to their imprisoned friends, but when, after Herculean efforts, they had unearthed but a few yards of the choked passage, and discovered the mangled remains of one of their fellows, they were forced to the conclusion that Tarzan and the second Waziri also lay dead beneath the rock mass further in, beyond human aid, and no longer susceptible of it. Again and again as they labored, they called aloud the names of their master and their comrade, but no answering call rewarded their listening ears. At last they gave up the search. Tearfully they cast a last look at the shattered tomb of their master, shouldered the heavy burden of gold that would at least furnish comfort, if not happiness, to their bereaved and beloved mistress, and made their mournful way back across the desolate valley of Opar, and downward through the forest beyond toward the distant bungalow. And as they marched, what sorry fate was already drawing down upon that peaceful, happy home? From the north came Achmet Zek, riding to the summons of his lieutenant's letter. With him came his horde of renegade Arabs, outlawed marauders, these and equally degraded blacks, garnered from the more debased and ignorant tribes of savage cannibals through whose countries the raider passed to and fro with perfect impunity. Mugambi, the ebon Hercules, who had shared the dangers and vicissitudes of his beloved Bwana from Jungle Island almost to the headwaters of the Ugambi, was the first to note the bold approach of the sinister caravan. He it was whom Tarzan had left in charge of the warriors who remained to guard Lady Greystoke, nor could a braver or more loyal guardian have been found in any clime or upon any soil. A giant in stature, a savage, fearless warrior, the huge black possessed also soul and judgment in proportion to his bulk and his ferocity. Not once since his master had departed had he been beyond sight or sound of the bungalow, except when Lady Greystoke chose to canter across the broad plain, or relieve the monotony of her loneliness by a brief hunting excursion. On such occasions Mugambi, mounted upon a wiry Arab, had ridden close at her horse's heels. The raiders were still a long way off when the warrior's keen eyes discovered them. For a time he stood scrutinizing the advancing party in silence, and then he turned and ran rapidly in the direction of the native huts which lay a few hundred yards below the bungalow. Here he called out to the lolling warriors. He issued orders rapidly. In compliance with them, the men seized upon their weapons and their shields. Some ran to call in the workers from the fields and to warn the tenders of the flocks and herds. The majority followed Mugambi back toward the bungalow. The dust of the raiders was still a long distance away. Mugambi could not know positively that it hid an enemy, but he had spent a lifetime of savage life in savage Africa, and he had seen parties before come thus unheralded. Sometimes they had come in peace, and sometimes they had come in war. One could never tell. It was well to be prepared. Mugambi did not like the haste with which the strangers advanced. The Greystoke bungalow was not well adapted for defence. No palisade surrounded it, for, situated as it was in the heart of loyal Waziri, its master had anticipated no possibility of an attack in force by any enemy. Heavy wooden shutters there were to close the window apertures against hostile arrows, and these Mugambi was engaged in lowering when Lady Greystoke appeared upon the veranda. "Why, Mugambi," she exclaimed, "what has happened? Why are you lowering the shutters?" Mugambi pointed out across the plain to where a white-robed force of mounted men was now distinctly visible. "Arabs," he explained. "They come for no good purpose in the absence of the great Bwana." Beyond the neat lawn and the flowering shrubs, Jane Clayton saw the glistening bodies of her Waziri. The sun glanced from the tips of their metal-shod spears, picked out the gorgeous colours in the feathers of their war bonnets, and reflected the highlights from the glossy skins of their broad shoulders and high cheekbones. Jane Clayton surveyed them with unmixed feelings of pride and affection. What harm could befall her with such as these to protect her? The raiders had halted now, 100 yards out upon the plain. Mugambi had hastened down to join his warriors. He advanced a few yards before them, and raising his voice, hailed the strangers. Achmet Zek sat straight in his saddle before his henchmen. "Arab," cried Mugambi, "what do you here?" "We come in peace," Achmet said, calling back. "Then turn and go in peace," replied Mugambi. "We do not want you here. There can be no peace between Arab and Waziri." Mugambi, although not born in Waziri, had been adopted into the tribe, which now contained no member more jealous of its traditions and its prowess than he. Achmet Zeg drew to one side of his horde, speaking to his men in a low voice. A moment later, without warning, a ragged volley was poured into the ranks of the Waziri. A couple of warriors fell, the others were for charging the attackers. But Mugambi was a cautious as well as a brave leader. He knew the futility of charging mounted men armed with muskets. He withdrew his force behind the shrubbery of the garden. Some he dispatched to various other parts of the grounds surrounding the bungalow. Half a dozen he sent to the bungalow itself, with instructions to keep their mistress within doors and to protect her with their lives. Adopting the tactics of the desert fighters from which he had sprung, Achmet Zek led his followers at a gallop in a long, thin line, describing a great circle which drew closer and closer in toward the defenders. At that part of the circle closest to the Waziri, a constant fusillade of shots was poured into the bushes behind which the black warriors had concealed themselves. The latter, on their part, loosed their slim shafts at the nearest of the enemy. The Waziri, justly famed for their archery, found no cause to blush for their performance that day. Time and again some swarthy horseman threw hands above his head and toppled from his saddle, pierced by a deadly arrow, but the contest was uneven. The Arabs outnumbered the Waziri. Their bullets penetrated the shrubbery and found marks that the Arab riflemen had not even seen. And then Achmet Zed circled inward a half-mile above the bungalow, tore down a section of the fence, and led his marauders within the grounds. Across the fields they charged at a mad run. Not again did they pause to lower fences. Instead, they drove their wild mounts straight for them, clearing the obstacles as lightly as winged gulls. Mugambi saw them coming, and, calling those of his warriors who remained, ran for the bungalow and the last stand. Upon the veranda, Lady Greystoke stood, rifle in hand. More than a single raider had accounted to her steady nerves and cool aim for his outlawry. More than a single pony raced, riderless, in the wake of the charging horde. Mugambi pushed his mistress back into the greater security of the interior, and with his depleted force prepared to make a last stand against the foe. On came the Arabs, shouting and waving their long guns above their heads. Past the veranda they raced, pouring a deadly fire into the kneeling Waziri, who discharged their volley of arrows from behind their long, oval shields. Shields well adapted perhaps to stop a hostile arrow or deflect a spear, but futile quite before the leaden missiles of the riflemen. From beneath the half-raised shutters of the bungalow, other bowmen did effective service in greater security, and after the first assault, Mugambi withdrew his entire force within the building. Again and again the Arabs charged, at last forming a stationary circle about the little fortress, and outside the effective range of the defenders' arrows. From their new position they fired at will at the windows. One by one the Waziri fell. Fewer and fewer were the arrows that replied to the guns of the raiders, and at last Achmet Zek felt safe in ordering an assault. Firing as they ran, the bloodthirsty horde raced for the veranda. A dozen of them fell to the arrows of the defenders, but the majority reached the door. Heavy gun butts fell upon it. The crash of splintered wood mingled with the report of a rifle as Jane Clayton fired through the panels upon the relentless foe. Upon both sides of the door men fell, but at last the frail barrier gave to the vicious assaults of the maddened attackers. It crumpled inward, and a dozen swarthy murderers leapt into the living room. At the far end stood Jane Clayton, surrounded by the remnant of her devoted guardians. The floor was covered by the bodies of those who already had given up their lives in her defense. In the forefront of her protectors stood the giant Mugambi. The Arabs raised their rifles to pour in the last volley that would effectually end all resistance, but Achmet Zeg roared out a warning order that stayed their trigger fingers. "Fire not upon the woman," he cried. "Who harms her dies. Take the woman alive." The Arabs rushed across the room. The Waziri met them with their heavy spears. Swords flashed. Long-barreled pistols roared out their sullen death dooms. Mugambi launched his spear at the nearest of the enemy with a force that drove the heavy shaft completely through the Arab's body. And then he seized a pistol from another, and grasping it by the barrel, brained all who forced their way too near his mistress. Emulating his example, the few warriors who remained to him fought like demons, but one by one they fell, until only Mugambi remained to defend the life and honor of the ape-man's mate. From across the room, Achmet Zeg watched the unequal struggle and urged on his minions. In his hands was a jeweled musket. Slowly he raised it to his shoulder, waiting until another move should place Mugambi at his mercy without endangering the lives of the woman or any of his own followers. At last the moment came, and Achmet Zeg pulled the trigger. Without a sound, the brave Mugambi sank to the floor at the feet of Jane Clayton. An instant later, she was surrounded and disarmed. Without a word, they dragged her from the bungalow. A giant Negro lifted her to the pommel of his saddle, and while the raiders searched the bungalow and outhouses for plunder, he rode with her beyond the gates and waited the coming of his master. Jane Clayton saw the raiders lead the horses from the corral and drive the herds in from the fields. She saw her home plundered of all that represented intrinsic worth in the eyes of the Arabs, and then she saw the torch applied and the flames licked up what remained. And, at last, when the raiders assembled after glutting their fury and their avarice, and rode away with her toward the north, she saw the smoke and the flames rising far into the heavens, until the winding of the trail into the thick forests hid the sad view from her eyes. As the flames ate their way into the living room, reaching out forked tongues to lick up the bodies of the dead, one of that gruesome company, whose bloody welterings had long since been stilled, moved again. It was a huge black who rolled over upon his side and opened bloodshot, suffering eyes. Mugambi, whom the Arabs had left for dead, still lived. The hot flames were almost upon him as he raised himself painfully upon his hands and knees and crawled slowly toward the doorway. Again and again he sank weakly to the floor, but each time he rose again and continued his pitiful way toward safety. After what seemed to him an interminable time, during which the flames had become a veritable fiery furnace at the far side of the room, the great black managed to reach the veranda, roll down the steps, and crawl off into the cool safety of some nearby shrubbery. All night he lay there, alternately unconscious and painfully sentient, and in the latter state watching with savage hatred the lurid flames which still rose from burning crib and haycock. A prowling lion roared close at hand, but the giant black was unafraid. There was place for but a single thought in his savage mind. Revenge! 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 Chapter 7. The Jewel Room of Opar. For some time Tarzan lay where he had fallen, upon the floor of the treasure chamber beneath the ruined walls of Opar. He lay as one dead, but he was not dead. At length he stirred. His eyes opened upon the utter darkness of the room. He raised his hand to his head and brought it away, sticky with clotted blood. He sniffed at his fingers as a wild beast might sniff at the lifeblood upon a wounded paw. Slowly he rose to a sitting posture, listening. No sound reached the buried depths of his sepulchre. He staggered to his feet and groped his way about among the tiers of ingots. What was he? Where was he? His head ached, but otherwise he felt no ill effects from the blow that had felled him. The accident he did not recall, nor did he recall aught of what had led up to it. He let his hands grope unfamiliarly over his limbs, his torso, and his head. He felt the quiver at his back, the knife in his loincloth. Something struggled for recognition within his brain. Ah, he had it. There was something missing. He crawled about upon the floor, feeling with his hands for the thing that instinct warned him was gone. At last he found it. The heavy war spear that in past years had formed so important a feature of his daily life, almost of his very existence, so inseparably had it been connected with his every action since the long-gone day that he had wrested his first spear from the body of a black victim of his savage training. Tarzan was sure that there was another and more lovely world than that which was confined to the darkness of the 4 stone walls surrounding him. He continued his search, and at last found the doorway leading inward beneath the city and the temple. This he followed most incautiously. He came to the stone steps leading upward to the higher level. He ascended them and continued onward toward the well. Nothing spurred his hurt memory to a recollection of past familiarity with his surroundings. He blundered on through the darkness as though he were traversing an open plain under the brilliance of a noonday sun, and suddenly there happened that which had to happen under the circumstances of his rash advance. He reached the brink of the well, stepped outward into space, lunged forward and shot downward into the inky depths below. Still clutching his spear, he struck the water and sank beneath its surface, plumbing the depths. The fall had not injured him, and when he rose to the surface he shook the water from his eyes and found that he could see. Daylight was filtering into the well from the orifice far above his head. It illumined the inner walls faintly. Tarzan gazed about him. On the level with the surface of the water he saw a large opening in the dark and slimy wall. He swam to it and drew himself out upon the wet floor of a tunnel. Along this he passed, but now he went warily, for Tarzan of the Apes was learning. The unexpected pit had taught him care in the traversing of dark passageways. He needed no second lesson. For a long distance the passage went straight as an arrow. The floor was slippery, as though at times the rising waters of the well overflowed and flooded it. This in itself retarded Tarzan's pace, for it was with difficulty that he kept his footing. The foot of a stairway ended the passage. Up this he made his way. It turned back and forth many times, leading at last into a small circular chamber, the gloom of which was relieved by a faint light which found ingress through a tubular shaft several feet in diameter, which rose from the centre of the room's ceiling upward to a distance of 100 feet or more, where it terminated in a stone grating through which Tarzan could see a blue and sunlit sky. Curiosity prompted the ape-man to investigate his surroundings. Several metal-bound, copper-studded chests constituted the sole furniture of the round room. Tarzan let his hands run over these. He felt of the copper studs, he pulled upon the hinges, and at last, by chance, he raised the cover of one. An exclamation of delight broke from his lips at sight of the pretty contents. Gleaming and glistening in the subdued light of the chamber lay a great tray full of brilliant stones. Tarzan, reverted to the primitive by his accident, had no conception of the fabulous value of his find. To him they were but pretty pebbles. He plunged his hands into them and let the priceless gems filter through his fingers. He went to others of the chests, only to find still further stores of precious stones. Nearly all were cut, and from these he gathered a handful, and filled the pouch which dangled at his side. The uncut stones he tossed back into the chests. Unwittingly the ape-man had stumbled upon the forgotten jewel-room of Opar. For ages it had lain buried beneath the temple of the flaming god, midway of one of the many inky passages which the superstitious descendants of the ancient sun-worshippers had either dared not or cared not to explore. Tiring at last of this diversion, Tarzan took up his way along the corridor which led upward from the jewel-room by a steep incline. Winding and twisting, but always tending upward, the tunnel led him nearer and nearer to the surface, ending finally in a low sealed room, lighter than any of that he had as yet discovered. Above him, an opening in the ceiling at the upper end of a flight of concrete steps revealed a brilliant sunlit scene. Tarzan viewed the vine-covered columns in mild wonderment. He puckered his brows in an attempt to recall some recollection of similar things. He was not sure of himself. There was a tantalizing suggestion always present in his mind that something was eluding him, that he should know many things which he did not know. His earnest cogitation was rudely interrupted by a thunderous roar from the opening above him. Following the roar came the cries and screams of men and women. Tarzan grasped his spear more firmly and ascended the steps. A strange light met his eyes as he emerged from the semi-darkness of the cellar to the brilliant light of the temple. The creatures he saw before him he recognized for what they were, men and women, and a huge lion. The men and women were scuttling for the safety of the exits. The lion stood upon the body of one who had been less fortunate than the others. He was in the center of the temple. Directly before Tarzan, a woman stood beside a block of stone. Upon the top of the stone lay stretched a man, and as the ape-man watched the scene, he saw the lion glare terribly at the two who remained within the temple. Another thunderous roar broke from the savage throat. The woman screamed and swooned across the body of the man stretched prostrate upon the stone altar before her. The lion advanced a few steps and crouched. The tip of his sinuous tail twitched nervously. He was upon the point of charging when his eyes were attracted toward the ape-man. Werper, helpless upon the altar, saw the great carnivore preparing to leap upon him. He saw the sudden change in the beast's expression as his eyes wandered to something beyond the altar and out of the Belgian's view. He saw the formidable creature rise to a standing position. A figure darted past Werper. He saw a mighty arm upraised and a stout spear shoot forward toward the lion to bury itself in the broad chest. He saw the lion snapping and tearing at the weapon's shaft, and he saw, wonder of wonders, the naked giant who had hurled the missile charging upon the great beast, only a long knife ready to meet those ferocious fangs and talons. The lion reared up to meet this new enemy. The beast was growling frightfully, and then upon the startled ears of the Belgian broke a similar savage growl from the lips of the man rushing upon the beast. By a quick sidestep, Tarzan eluded the first swinging clutch of the lion's paws. Darting to the beast's side, he leapt upon the tawny back. His arms encircled the maned neck, his teeth sank deep into the brute's flesh. Roaring, leaping, rolling, and struggling, the giant cat attempted to dislodge this savage enemy, and all the while one great brown fist was driving a long, keen blade repeatedly into the beast's side. During the battle, La regained consciousness. Spellbound, she stood above her victim, watching the spectacle. It seemed incredible that a human being could best the king of beasts in personal encounter, and yet before her very eyes there was taking place just such an improbability. At last Tarzan's knife found the great heart, and with a final spasmodic struggle the lion rolled over upon the marble floor, dead. Leaping to his feet, the conqueror placed a foot upon the carcass of his kill, raised his face toward the heavens, and gave voice to so hideous a cry that both La and Werper trembled as it reverberated through the temple. Then the ape-man turned, and Werper recognized him as the man he had left for dead in the treasure room. Chapter 8. The Escape from Opar. Werper was astounded. Could this creature be the same dignified Englishman who had entertained him so graciously in his luxurious African home? Could this wild beast with blazing eyes and bloody countenance be at the same time a man? Could the horrid victory cry he had but just heard have been formed in human throat? Tarzan was eyeing the man and the woman, a puzzled expression in his eyes, but there was no faintest tinge of recognition. It was as though he had discovered some new species of living creature and was marveling at his find. La was studying the ape-man's features. Slowly her large eyes opened very wide. "Tarzan," she exclaimed, and then, in the vernacular of the great apes which constant association with the anthropoids had rendered the common language of the Oparians, "you have come back to me. La has ignored the mandates of her religion, waiting, always waiting for Tarzan, for her Tarzan. She has taken no mate, for in all the world there was but one with whom La would mate. And now you have come back. Tell me, O Tarzan, that it is for me you have returned." Werper listened to the unintelligible jargon. He looked from La to Tarzan. Would the latter understand this strange tongue? To the Belgian's surprise, the Englishman answered in a language evidently identical to hers. "Tarzan," he repeated musingly. Tarzan. The name sounds familiar. It is your name. You are Tarzan, cried La. I am Tarzan. The ape-man shrugged. Well, it is a good name. I know no other, so I will keep it, but I do not know you. I did not come hither for you. Why I came I do not know at all, neither do I know from whence I came. Can you tell me? La shook her head. I never knew, she replied. Tarzan turned toward Werper and put the same question to him, but in the language of the great apes. The Belgian shook his head. I do not understand that language, he said in French. Without effort, and apparently without realizing that he made the change, Tarzan repeated his question in French. Werper suddenly came to a full realization of the magnitude of the injury of which Tarzan was a victim. The man had lost his memory. No longer could he recollect past events. The Belgian was upon the point of enlightening him when it suddenly occurred to him that by keeping Tarzan in ignorance, for a time at least, of his true identity, it might be possible to turn the ape-man's misfortune to his own advantage. I cannot tell you from whence you came, he said, but this I can tell you. If you do not get out of this horrible place, we shall both be slain upon this bloody altar. The woman was about to plunge her knife into my heart when the lion interrupted the fiendish ritual. Come, before they recover from their fright and reassemble, let us find a way out of this damnable temple. Tarzan turned again toward La. Why, he asked, would you have killed this man? Are you hungry? The high priestess cried out in disgust. Did he attempt to kill you? Continued Tarzan. The woman shook her head. Then why should you have wished to kill him? Tarzan was determined to get to the bottom of the thing. La raised her slender arm and pointed toward the sun. We are offering up his soul as a gift to the flaming god, she said. Tarzan looked puzzled. He was again an ape, and apes do not understand such matters as souls and flaming gods. Do you wish to die? He asked Werper. The Belgian assured him with tears in his eyes that he did not wish to die. Very well, then, you shall not, said Tarzan. Come, we will go. This she would kill you and keep me for herself. It is no place, anyway, for a Mangani. I should soon die, shut up behind these stone walls. He turned toward La. We are going now, he said. The woman rushed forward and seized the ape-man's hands in hers. Do not leave me, she cried. Stay, and you shall be high priest. La loves you. All Opar shall be yours. Slaves shall wait upon you. Stay, Tarzan of the apes, and let love reward you. The ape-man pushed the kneeling woman aside. Tarzan does not desire you, he said. Simply, and stepping to Werper's side, he cut the Belgian's bonds and motioned him to follow. Panting, her face convulsed with rage, La sprang to her feet. Stay, you shall, she screamed. La will have you. If she cannot have you alive, she will have you dead. And raising her face to the sun, she gave voice to the same hideous shriek that Werper had heard once before and Tarzan many times. In answer to her cry, a babble of voices broke from the surrounding chambers and corridors. Come, guardian priests, she cried. The infidels have profaned the holiest of the holies. Come, strike terror to their hearts, defend La and her altar, wash clean the temple with the blood of the polluters. Tarzan understood, though Werper did not. The former glanced at the Belgian and saw that he was unarmed. Stepping quickly to La's side, the ape-man seized her in his strong arms, and though she fought with all the mad savagery of a demon, he soon disarmed her, handing her long sacrificial knife to Werper. You will need this, he said, and then from each doorway a horde of the monstrous little men of Opar streamed into the temple. They were armed with bludgeons and knives, and fortified in their courage by fanatical hate and frenzy. Verpa was terrified. Tarzan stood, eyeing the foe in proud disdain. Slowly he advanced toward the exit he had chosen to utilize in making his way from the temple. A burly priest barred his way. Behind the first was a score of others. Tarzan swung his heavy spear, club-like, down upon the skull of the priest. The fellow collapsed, his head crushed. Again and again the weapon fell as Tarzan made his way slowly toward the doorway. Verpa pressed close behind, casting backward glances toward the shrieking, dancing mob menacing their rear. He held the sacrificial knife ready to strike whoever might come within its reach, but none came. For a time he wondered that they should so bravely battle with the giant ape-man, yet hesitate to rush upon him who was relatively so weak. Had they done so, he knew that he must have fallen at the first charge. Tarzan had reached the doorway over the corpses of all that had stood to dispute his way, before Verpa guessed at the reason for his immunity. The priests feared the sacrificial knife. Willingly would they face death and welcome it if it came while they defended their high priestess and her altar, but evidently there were deaths and deaths. Some strange superstition mist surrounded that polished blade, that no Oparian cared to chance a death thrust from it, yet gladly rushed to the slaughter of the ape-man's flaying spear. Once outside the temple court, Verpa communicated his discovery to Tarzan. The ape-man grinned and let Verpa go before him, brandishing the jeweled and holy weapon. Like leaves before a gale, the Oparians scattered in all directions, and Tarzan and the Belgian found a clear passage through the corridors and chambers of the ancient temple. The Belgian's eyes went wide as they passed through the room of the 7 pillars of solid gold. With ill-concealed avarice he looked upon the age-old golden tablets set in the walls of nearly every room and down the sides of many of the corridors. To the ape-man, all this wealth appeared to mean nothing. On the two went, chance leading them toward the broad avenue which lay between the stately piles of the half-ruined edifices and the inner wall of the city. Great apes jabbered at them and menaced them, but Tarzan answered them after their own kind, giving back taunt for taunt, insult for insult, challenge for challenge. Verpa saw a hairy bull swing down from a broken column and advance, stiff-legged and bristling toward the naked giant. The yellow fangs were bared. Angry snarls and barkings rumbled threateningly through the thick and hanging lips. The Belgian watched his companion. To his horror, he saw the man stoop until his closed knuckles rested upon the ground, as did those of the anthropoid. He saw him circle, stiff-legged, about the circling ape. He heard the same bestial barkings and growlings issued from the human throat that were coming from the mouth of the brute. Had his eyes been closed, he could not have known but that 2 giant apes were bridling for combat. But there was no battle. It ended as the majority of such jungle encounters end. One of the boasters loses his nerve and becomes suddenly interested in a blowing leaf, a beetle, or the lice upon his hairy stomach. In this instance, it was the anthropoid that retired in stiff dignity to inspect an unhappy caterpillar, which he presently devoured. For a moment, Tarzan seemed inclined to pursue the argument. He swaggered truculently, stuck out his chest, roared, and advanced closer to the bull. It was with difficulty that Verpa finally persuaded him to leave well enough alone and continue his way from the ancient city of the sun-worshippers. The two searched for nearly an hour before they found the narrow exit through the inner wall. From there, the well-worn trail led them beyond the outer fortification to the desolate valley of Opar. Tarzan had no idea, in so far as Werper could discover, as to where he was or whence he came. He wandered aimlessly about, searching for food, which he discovered beneath small rocks or hiding in the shade of the scant brush which dotted the ground. The Belgian was horrified by the hideous menu of his companion. Beetles, rodents, and caterpillars were devoured with seeming relish. Tarzan was indeed an ape again. At last Werper succeeded in leading his companion toward the distant hills which mark the northwestern boundary of the valley, and together the two set out in the direction of the Greystoke bungalow. What purpose prompted the Belgian in leading the victim of his treachery and greed back toward his former home, it is difficult to guess, unless it was that without Tarzan there could be no ransom for Tarzan's wife. That night they camped in the valley beyond the hills, and as they sat before a little fire where cooked a wild pig that had fallen to one of Tarzan's arrows, the latter sat lost in speculation. He seemed continually to be trying to grasp some mental image which has constantly eluded him. At last he opened the leathern pouch which hung at his side. From it he poured into the palm of his hand a quantity of glittering gems. The firelight playing upon them conjured a multitude of scintillating rays, and as the wide eyes of the Belgian looked on in rapt fascination, the man's expression at last acknowledged a tangible purpose in courting the society of the ape-man. Chapter 9. The Theft of the Jewels. For 2 days Werper sought for the party that had accompanied him from the camp to the barrier cliffs, but not until late in the afternoon of the second day did he find clue to its whereabouts, and then in such gruesome form that he was totally unnerved by the sight. In an open glade he came upon the bodies of 3 of the blacks, terribly mutilated, nor did it require considerable deductive power to explain their murder. Of the little party, only these 3 had not been slaves. The others, evidently tempted to hope for freedom from their cruel Arab master, had taken advantage of their separation from the main camp to slay the 3 representatives of the hated power which held them in slavery and vanish into the jungle. Cold sweat exuded from Werper's forehead as he contemplated the fate which chance had permitted him to escape, for had he been present when the conspiracy bore fruit, he, too, must have been of the garnered. Tarzan showed not the slightest surprise or interest in the discovery. Inherent in him was a calloused familiarity with violent death. The refinements of his recent civilization, expunged by the force of the sad calamity which had befallen him, left only the primitive sensibilities which his childhood's training had imprinted indelibly upon the fabric of his mind. The training of Kala, the examples and precepts of Kerchak, of Tublat, and of Turkos now formed the basis of his every thought and action. He retained a mechanical knowledge of French and English speech. Werper had spoken to him in French, and Tarzan had replied in the same tongue without conscious realization that he had departed from the anthropoidal speech in which he had addressed La. Had Werper used English, the result would have been the same. Again that night, as the two sat before their campfire, Tarzan played with his shining baubles. Werper asked him what they were and where he had found them. The ape-man replied that they were gay-coloured stones, with which he purposed fashioning a necklace, and that he had found them far beneath the sacrificial court of the temple of the flaming god. Werper was relieved to find that Tarzan had no conception of the value of the gems. This would make it easier for the Belgian to obtain possession of them. Possibly the man would give them to him for the asking. Werper reached out his hand toward the little pile that Tarzan had arranged upon a piece of flat wood before him. "Let me see them," said the Belgian. Tarzan placed a large palm over his treasure. He bared his fighting fangs and growled. Werper withdrew his hand more quickly than he had advanced it. Tarzan resumed his playing with the gems and his conversation with Werper as though nothing unusual had occurred. He had but exhibited the beast's jealous protective instinct for a possession. When he killed, he shared the meat with Werper, but had Werper ever by accident laid a hand upon Tarzan's share, he would have aroused the same savage and resentful warning. From that occurrence dated the beginning of a great fear in the breast of the Belgian for his savage companion. He had never understood the transformation that had been wrought in Tarzan by the blow upon his head, other than to attribute it to a form of amnesia. That Tarzan had once been, in truth, a savage jungle beast, Werper had not known, and so, of course, he could not guess that the man had reverted to the state in which his childhood and young manhood had been spent. Now Werper saw in the Englishman a dangerous maniac, whom the slightest untoward accident might turn upon him with rending fangs. Not for a moment did Werper attempt to delude himself into the belief that he could defend himself successfully against an attack by the ape-man. His one hope lay in eluding him and making for the far-distant camp of Achmet Zek as rapidly as he could, but armed only with the sacrificial knife, Werper shrank from attempting the journey through the jungle. Tarzan constituted a protection that was by no means despicable, even in the face of the larger carnivora, as Werper had reason to acknowledge from the evidence he had witnessed in the Oparian temple. Too, Werper had his covetous soul set upon the pouch of gems, and so he was torn between the various emotions of avarice and fear. But avarice it was that burned most strongly in his breast, to the end that he dared the dangers and suffered the terrors of constant association with him he thought a madman, rather than give up the hope of obtaining possession of the fortune which the contents of the little pouch represented. Achmet Zek should know nothing of these. These would be for Werper alone, and so soon as he could encompass his design he would reach the coast and take passage for America, where he could conceal himself beneath the veil of a new identity and enjoy to some measure the fruits of his theft. He had it all planned out, did Lieutenant Albert Werper, living in anticipation the luxurious life of the idle rich. He even found himself regretting that America was so provincial, and that nowhere in the New World was a city that might compare with his beloved Brussels. It was upon the third day of their progress from Opar that the keen ears of Tarzan caught the sound of men behind them. Werper heard nothing above the humming of the jungle insects and the chattering life of the lesser monkeys and the birds. For a time Tarzan stood in statuesque silence, listening, his sensitive nostrils dilating as he essayed each passing breeze. Then he withdrew Werper into the concealment of thick brush and waited. Presently, along the game trail that Werper and Tarzan had been following, there came in sight a sleek black warrior, alert and watchful. In single file behind him there followed one after another, near 50 others, each burdened with 2 dull yellow ingots lashed upon his back. Werper recognized the party immediately as that which had accompanied Tarzan on his journey to Opar. He glanced at the ape-man, but in the savage, watchful eyes he saw no recognition of Bazuli and those other loyal Waziri. When all had passed, Tarzan rose and emerged from concealment. He looked down the trail in the direction the party had gone. Then he turned to Werper. "We will follow and slay them," he said. "Why?" asked the Belgian. "They are black," explained Tarzan. "It was a black who killed Kala. They are the enemies of the Manganis." Werper did not relish the idea of engaging in a battle with Bazuli and his fierce fighting men. And again he had welcomed the sight of them returning toward the Greystoke bungalow, for he had begun to have doubts as to his ability to retrace his steps to the Waziri country. Tarzan, he knew, had not the remotest idea of whither they were going. By keeping at a safe distance behind the laden warriors, they would have no difficulty in following them home. Once at the bungalow, Verper knew the way to the camp of Achmet Zek. There was still another reason why he did not wish to interfere with the Waziri. They were bearing the great burden of treasure in the direction he wished it borne. The farther they took it, the less the distance that he and Achmet Zek would have to transport it. He argued with the ape-man, therefore, against the latter's desire to exterminate the blacks, and at last he prevailed upon Tarzan to follow them in peace, saying that he was sure they would lead them out of the forest into a rich country teeming with game. It was many marches from Opar to the Waziri country, but at last came the hour when Tarzan and the Belgian, following the trail of the warriors, topped the last rise, and saw before them the broad Waziri plain, the winding river, and the distant forests to the north and west. A mile or more ahead of them, the line of warriors was creeping like a giant caterpillar through the tall grasses of the plain. Beyond, grazing herds of zebra, hartebeest, and topi dotted the level landscape, while closer to the river a bull buffalo, his head and shoulders protruding from the reeds, watched the advancing blacks for a moment, only to turn at last and disappear into the safety of his dank and gloomy retreat. Tarzan looked out across the familiar vista with no faintest gleam of recognition in his eyes. He saw the game animals, and his mouth watered, but he did not look in the direction of his bungalow. Verper, however, did. A puzzled expression entered the Belgian's eyes. He shaded them with his palms and gazed long and earnestly toward the spot where the bungalow had stood. He could not credit the testimony of his eyes. There was no bungalow, no barns, no outhouses. The corrals, the haystacks, all were gone. What could it mean? And then, slowly there filtered into Verper's consciousness an explanation of the havoc that had been wrought in that peaceful valley since last his eyes had rested upon it. Achmet Zek had been there. Bazuli and his warriors had noted the devastation the moment they had come in sight of the farm. Now they hastened on toward it, talking excitedly among themselves in animated speculation upon the cause and meaning of the catastrophe. When, at last, they crossed the trampled garden and stood before the charred ruins of their master's bungalow, their greatest fears became convictions in the light of the evidence about them. Remnants of the human dead, half devoured by prowling hyenas and others of the carnivora which infested the region, lay rotting upon the ground, and among the corpses remained sufficient remnants of their clothing and ornaments to make clear to Bazuli the frightful story of the disaster that had befallen his master's house. "The Arabs," he said, as his men clustered about him. The Waziri gazed about in mute rage for several minutes. Everywhere they encountered only further evidence of the ruthlessness of the cruel enemy that had come during the great Bwana's absence and laid waste his property. "What did they with Lady?" asked one of the blacks. They had always called Lady Greystoke thus. "The women they would have taken with them," said Bazuli, "our women and his." A giant black raised his spear above his head and gave voice to a savage cry of rage and hate. The others followed his example. Bazuli silenced them with a gesture. "There is no time for useless noises of the mouth," he said. "The great Bwana has taught us that it is acts by which things are done, not words. Let us save our breath. We shall need it all to follow up the Arabs and slay them. If Lady and our women live, the greater the need of haste, and warriors cannot travel fast upon empty lungs." From the shelter of the reeds along the river, Verper and Tarzan watched the blacks. They saw them dig a trench with their knives and fingers, they saw them lay open their yellow burdens in it and scoop the overturned earth back over the tops of the ingots. Tarzan seemed a little interested, after Werper had assured him that that which they buried was not good to eat, but Werper was intensely interested. He would have given much, had he had his own followers with him, that he might take away the treasure as soon as the blacks left, for he was sure that they would leave this scene of desolation and death as soon as possible. The treasure buried, the blacks removed themselves a short distance upwind from the fetid corpses, where they made their camp, that they might rest before setting out in pursuit of the Arabs. It was already dusk. Werper and Tarzan sat devouring some pieces of meat they had brought from their last camp. The Belgian was occupied with his plans for the immediate future. He was positive that the Waziri would pursue Achmet Zeg, for he knew enough of savage warfare and of the characteristics of the Arabs and their degraded followers to guess that they had carried the Waziri women off into slavery. This alone would assure immediate pursuit by so warlike a people as the Waziri. Werper felt that he should find the means and the opportunity to push on ahead, that he might warn Achmet Zek of the coming of Basuli and also of the location of the buried treasure. What the Arab would now do with Lady Greystoke, in view of the mental affliction of her husband, Werper neither knew nor cared. It was enough that the golden treasure buried upon the site of the buried bungalow was infinitely more valuable than any ransom that would have occurred even to the avaricious mind of the Arab, and if Werper could persuade the raider to share even a portion of it with him, he would be well satisfied. But by far the most important consideration, to Werper at least, was the incalculably valuable treasure in the little leathern pouch at Tarzan's side. If he could but obtain possession of this, he would. His eyes wandered to the object of his greed. They measured Tarzan's giant frame and rested upon the rounded muscles of his arms. It was hopeless. What could he, Werper, hope to accomplish other than his own death by an attempt to wrest the gems from their savage owner? Disconsolate, Werper threw himself upon his side. His head was pillowed on one arm, the other rested across his face in such a way that his eyes were hidden from the ape-man, though one of them was fastened upon him from beneath the shadow of the Belgian's forearm. For a time he lay thus, glowering at Tarzan, and originating schemes for plundering him of his treasure, schemes that were discarded as futile as rapidly as they were born. Tarzan presently let his own eyes rest upon Werper. The Belgian saw that he was being watched and lay very still. After a few moments he simulated the regular breathing of deep slumber. Tarzan had been thinking. He had seen the Waziri bury their belongings. Werper had told them that they were hiding them lest someone find them and take them away. This seemed to Tarzan a splendid plan for safeguarding valuables. Since Werper had evinced a desire to possess his glittering pebbles, Tarzan, with the suspicions of a savage, had guarded the baubles of whose worth he was entirely ignorant, as zealously as though they spelled life or death to him. For a long time the ape-man sat watching his companion. At last, convinced that he slept, Tarzan withdrew his hunting knife and commenced to dig a hole in the ground before him. With the blade he loosened up the earth, and with his hands he scooped it out until he had excavated a little cavity a few inches in diameter and 5 or 6 inches in depth. Into this he placed the pouch of jewels. Werper almost forgot to breathe after the fashion of a sleeper as he saw what the ape-man was doing. He scarce repressed an ejaculation of satisfaction. Tarzan became suddenly rigid as his keen ears noted the cessation of the regular inspirations and expirations of his companion. His narrowed eyes bored straight down upon the Belgian. Werper felt that he was lost. He must risk all on his ability to carry on the deception. He sighed, threw both arms outward, and turned over on his back, mumbling as though in the throes of a bad dream. A moment later he resumed the regular breathing. Now he could not watch Tarzan, but he was sure that the man sat for a long time looking at him. Then, faintly, Verpa heard the other's hands scraping dirt and later patting it down. He knew then that the jewels were buried. It was an hour before Verpa moved again, and then he rolled over facing Tarzan and opened his eyes. The ape-man slept. By reaching out his hand, Verpa could touch the spot where the pouch was buried. For a long time he lay watching and listening. He moved about, making more noise than necessary, yet Tarzan did not awaken. He drew the sacrificial knife from his belt and plunged it into the ground. Tarzan did not move. Cautiously the Belgian pushed the blade downward through the loose earth above the pouch. He felt the point touch the soft, tough fabric of the leather. And then he pried down upon the handle. Slowly the little mound of loose earth rose and parted. An instant later a corner of the pouch came into view. Verpa pulled it from its hiding place and tucked it in his shirt. Then he refilled the hole and pressed the dirt carefully down as it had been before. Greed had prompted him to an act, the discovery of which by his companion could lead only to the most frightful consequences for Verpa. Already he could almost feel those strong white fangs burying themselves in his neck. He shuddered. Far out across the plain a leopard screamed, and in the dense reeds behind him some great beast moved on padded feet. Verpa feared these prowlers of the night, but infinitely more he feared the just wrath of the human beast sleeping at his side. With utmost caution the Belgian arose. Tarzan did not move. Verpa took a few steps toward the plain and the distant forest to the northwest. And then he paused and fingered the hilt of the long knife in his belt. He turned and looked down upon the sleeper. "Why not?" he mused. "Then I should be safe." He returned and bent over the ape-man. Clutched tightly in his hand was the sacrificial knife of the high priestess of the flaming god. Chapter 10. Achmet Zek sees the jewels. Mugambi, weak and suffering, had dragged his painful way along the trail of the retreating raiders. He could move but slowly, resting often. But savage hatred and an equally savage desire for vengeance kept him to his task. As the days passed, his wounds healed and his strength returned, until at last his giant frame had regained all of its former mighty powers. Now he went more rapidly, but the mounted Arabs had covered a great distance while the wounded black had been painfully crawling after them. They had reached their fortified camp, and there Achmet Zek awaited the return of his lieutenant, Albert Verpa. During the long, rough journey, Jane Clayton had suffered more in anticipation of her impending fate than from the hardships of the road. Achmet Zek had not deigned to acquaint her with his intentions regarding her future. She prayed that she had been captured in the hope of ransom, for if such should prove the case, no great harm would befall her at the hands of the Arabs. But there was the chance, the horrid chance, that another fate awaited her. She had heard of many women, among whom were white women, who had been sold by outlaws such as Achmet Zek into the slavery of black harems, or taken farther north into the almost equally hideous existence of some Turkish seraglio. Jane Clayton was of sterner stuff than that which bends in spineless terror before danger. Until hope proved futile, she would not give it up, nor did she entertain thoughts of self-destruction only as a final escape from dishonor. So long as Tarzan lived, there was every reason to expect succor. No man nor beast who roamed the savage continent could boast the cunning and the powers of her lord and master. To her he was little short of omnipotent in his native world, this world of savage beasts and savage men. Tarzan would come, and she would be rescued and avenged, of that she was certain. She counted the days that must elapse before he would return from Opar and discover what had transpired during his absence. After that, it would be but a short time before he had surrounded the Arab stronghold and punished the motley crew of wrongdoers who inhabited it. That he could find her, that she had no slightest doubt. No spoor, however faint, could elude the keen vigilance of his senses. To him, the trail of the raiders would be as plain as the printed page of an open book to her. And while she hoped, there came through the dark jungle another. Terrified by night and by day came Albert Werper. A dozen times he had escaped the claws and fangs of the giant carnivora only by what seemed a miracle to him. Armed with nothing more than the knife he had brought with him from Opar, he had made his way through as savage a country as yet exists upon the face of the globe. By night he had slept in trees. By day he had stumbled fearfully on, often taking refuge among the branches when sight or sound of some great cat warned him from danger. But at last he had come within sight of the palisade behind which were his fierce companions. At almost the same time, Mugambi came out of the jungle before the walled village. As he stood in the shadow of a great tree, reconnoitering, he saw a man, ragged and dishevelled, emerge from the jungle almost at his elbow. Instantly he recognized the newcomer as he had been a guest of his master before the latter had departed for Opar. The black was upon the point of hailing the Belgian when something stayed him. He saw the white man walking confidently across the clearing toward the village gate. No sane man thus approached a village in this part of Africa unless he was sure of a friendly welcome. Mugambi waited. His suspicions were aroused. He heard Werper halloo, he saw the gates swing open, and he witnessed the surprised and friendly welcome that was accorded the erstwhile guest of Lord and Lady Greystoke. A light broke upon the understanding of Mugambi. This white man had been a traitor and a spy. It was to him they owed the raid during the absence of the great Bwana. To his hate for the Arabs, Mugambi added a still greater hate for the white spy. Within the village, Werper passed hurriedly toward the silken tent of Achmet Zek. The Arab arose as his lieutenant entered. His face showed surprise as he viewed the tattered apparel of the Belgian. "What has happened?" he asked. Werper narrated all, save the little matter of the pouch of gems which were now tightly strapped about his waist, beneath his clothing. The Arab's eyes narrowed greedily as his henchman described the treasure that the Waziri had buried beside the ruins of the Greystoke bungalow. "It will be a simple matter now to return and get it," said Achmet Zek. "First we will await the coming of the rash Waziri, and after we have slain them we may take our time to the treasure. None will disturb it where it lies, for we shall leave some alive who know of its existence." "And a woman?" asked Werper. "I shall sell her in the north," replied the raider. "It is the only way now. She should bring a good price." The Belgian nodded. He was thinking rapidly. If he could persuade Achmet Zek to send him in command of the party which took Lady Greystoke north, it would give him the opportunity he craved to make his escape from his chief. He would forego a share of the gold, if he could but get away unscathed with the jewels. He knew Achmet Zek well enough by this time to know that no member of his band ever was voluntarily released from the service of Achmet Zek. Most of the few who deserted were recaptured. More than once had Werper listened to their agonized screams as they were tortured before being put to death. The Belgian had no wish to take the slightest chance of recapture. "Who will go north with the woman?" he asked, "while we are returning for the gold that the Waziri buried by the bungalow of the Englishman?" Achmet Zek thought for a moment. The buried gold was of much greater value than the price the woman would bring. It was necessary to rid himself of her as quickly as possible, and it was also well to obtain the gold with the least possible delay. Of all his followers, the Belgian was the most logical lieutenant to entrust with the command of one of the parties. An Arab, as familiar with the trails and tribes as Achmet Zet himself, might collect the woman's price and make good his escape into the far north. Werper, on the other hand, could scarce make his escape alone through a country hostile to Europeans, while the men he would send with the Belgian could be carefully selected with a view to preventing Werper from persuading any considerable portion of his command to accompany him should he contemplate desertion of his chief. At last the Arab spoke. "It is not necessary that we both return for the gold. You shall go north with the woman, carrying a letter to a friend of mine who is always in touch with the best markets for such merchandise, while I return for the gold. We can meet again here when our business is concluded." Werper could scarce disguise the joy with which he received this welcome decision. And that he did entirely disguise it from the keen and suspicious eyes of Achmet Zek is open to question. However, the decision reached, the Arab and his lieutenant discussed the details of their forthcoming ventures for a short time further, when Werper made his excuses and returned to his own tent for the comforts and luxury of a long-desired bath and shave. Having bathed, the Belgian tied a small hand mirror to a cord sewn to the rear wall of his tent, placed a rude chair beside an equally rude table that stood beside the glass, and proceeded to remove the rough stubble from his face. In the catalogue of masculine pleasures there is scarce one which imparts a feeling of greater comfort and refreshment than follows a clean shave, and now, with weariness temporarily banished, Albert Werper crawled in his rickety chair to enjoy a final cigarette before retiring. His thumbs, tucked in his belt in lazy support of the weight of his arms, touched the belt which held the jewel pouch about his waist. He tingled with excitement as he let his mind dwell upon the value of the treasure which, unknown to all save himself, lay hidden beneath his clothing. What would Achmet Zek say if he knew? Werper grinned. How the old rascal's eyes would pop could he but have a glimpse of those scintillating beauties. Werper had never yet had an opportunity to feast his eyes for any great length of time upon them. He had not even counted them, only roughly had he guessed at their value. He unfastened the belt and drew the pouch from its hiding place. He was alone. The banners of the camp, save the sentries, had retired. None would enter the Belgian's tent. He fingered the pouch, feeling out the shapes and sizes of the precious little nodules within. He hefted the bag first in one palm, then in the other, and at last he wheeled his chair slowly around before the table, and in the rays of his small lamp let the glittering gems roll out upon the rough wood. The refulgent rays transformed the interior of the soiled and squalid canvas to the splendor of a palace in the eyes of the dreaming man. He saw the gilded hails of pleasure that would open their portals to the possessor of the wealth which lay scattered upon this stained and dented tabletop. He dreamed of joys and luxuries and power which had always been beyond his grasp, and as he dreamed his gaze lifted from the table, as the gaze of a dreamer will, to a far distant goal above the mean horizon of terrestrial commonplaceness. Unseeing, his eyes rested upon the shaving mirror which still hung upon the tent wall above the table, but his sight was focused far beyond. And then a reflection moved within the polished surface of the tiny glass. The man's eyes shot back out of space to the mirror's face, and in it he saw reflected the grim visage of Achmet Zek, framed in the flaps of the tent doorway behind him. Werper stifled a gasp of dismay. With rare self-possession, he let his gaze drop, without appearing to have halted upon the mirror, until it rested again upon the gems. Without haste, he replaced them in the pouch, tucked the latter into his shirt, selected a cigarette from his case, lighted it, and rose. Yawning, and stretching his arms above his head, he turned slowly toward the opposite end of the tent. The face of Achmet Zek had disappeared from the opening. To say that Albert Werper was terrified would be putting it mildly. He realized that he not only had sacrificed his treasure, but his life as well. Achmet Zek would never permit the wealth that he had discovered to slip through his fingers, nor would he forgive the duplicity of a lieutenant who had gained possession of such a treasure without offering to share it with his chief. Slowly, the Belgian prepared for bed. If he were being watched, he could not know, but if so, the watcher saw no indication of the nervous excitement which the European strove to conceal. When ready for his blankets, the man crossed to the little table and extinguished the light. It was 2 hours later that the flaps at the front of the tent separated silently and gave entrance to a dark-robed figure, which passed noiselessly from the darkness without to the darkness within. Cautiously the prowler crossed the interior. In one hand was a long knife. He came at last to the pile of blankets spread upon several rugs close to one of the tent walls. Lightly, his fingers sought and found the bulk beneath the blankets, the bulk that should be Albert Werper. They traced out the figure of a man, and then an arm shot upward, poised for an instant, and descended. Again and again it rose and fell, and each time the long blade of the knife buried itself in the thing beneath the blankets. But there was an initial lifelessness in the silent bulk that gave the assassin momentary wonder. Feverishly he threw back the coverlets and searched with nervous hands for the pouch of jewels which he expected to find concealed upon his victim's body. An instant later he rose with a curse upon his lips. It was Achmet Zek, and he cursed because he had discovered beneath the blankets of his lieutenant only a pile of discarded clothing arranged in the form and semblance of a sleeping man. Albert Werper had fled. Out into the village ran the chief, calling in angry tones to the sleepy Arabs, who tumbled from their tents in answer to his voice. But though they searched the village again and again, they found no trace of the Belgian. Foaming with anger, Achmet Zek called his followers to horse, and though the night was pitchy black, they set out to scour the adjoining forest for their quarry. As they galloped from the open gates, Mugambi, hiding in a nearby bush, slipped unseen within the palisade. A score of blacks crowded about the entrance to watch the searchers depart, and as the last of them passed out of the village, the blacks seized the portals and drew them too, and Mugambi lent a hand in the work as though the best of his life had been spent among the raiders. In the darkness he passed unchallenged as one of their number, and as they returned from the gates to their respective tents and huts, Mugambi melted into the shadows and disappeared. For an hour he crept about in the rear of the various huts and tents in an effort to locate that in which his master's mate was imprisoned. One there was which he was reasonably assured contained her, for it was the only hut before the door of which a sentry had been posted. Mugambi was crouching in the shadow of this structure, just around the corner from the unsuspecting guard, when another approached to relieve his comrade. "The prisoner is safe within?" asked the newcomer. "She is," replied the other, "for none has passed this doorway since I came." The new sentry squatted beside the door, while he, whom he had relieved, made his way to his own hut. Mugambi slunk closer to the corner of the building. In one powerful hand he gripped a heavy knobstick. No sign of elation disturbed his phlegmatic calm, yet inwardly he was aroused to joy by the proof he had just heard that Lady really was within. The sentry's back was toward the corner of the hut which hid the giant black. The fellow did not see the huge form which silently loomed behind him. The knobstick swung upward in a curve and downward again. There was the sound of a dull thud, the crushing of heavy bone, and the sentry slumped into a silent, inanimate lump of clay. A moment later, Mugambi was searching the interior of the hut, at first slowly, calling "Lady" in a low whisper, and finally with almost frantic haste, until the truth presently dawned upon him. The hut was empty. Chapter 11. Tarzan becomes a beast again. For a moment Werper had stood above the sleeping ape-man, his murderous knife poised for the fatal thrust, but fear stayed his hand. What if the first blow should fail to drive the point to his victim's heart? Werper shuddered in contemplation of the disastrous consequences to himself. Awakened, and even with a few moments of life remaining, the giant could literally tear his assailant to pieces should he choose, and the Belgian had no doubt but that Tarzan would so choose. Again came the soft sound of padded footsteps in the reeds, closer this time. Werper abandoned his design. Before him stretched the wide plain and escape. The jewels were in his possession. To remain longer was to risk death at the hands of Tarzan, or the jaws of the hunter creeping ever nearer. Turning, he slunk away through the night toward the distant forest. Tarzan slept on. Where were those uncanny guardian powers that had formerly rendered him immune from the dangers of surprise? Could this dull sleeper be the alert, sensitive Tarzan of old? Perhaps the blow upon his head had numbed his senses, temporarily, who may say? Closer crept the stealthy creature through the reeds. The rustling curtain of vegetation parted a few paces from where the sleeper lay, and the massive head of a lion appeared. The beast surveyed the ape-man intently for a moment. Then he crouched, his hind feet drawn well beneath him, his tail lashing from side to side. It was the beating of the beast's tail against the reeds which awakened Tarzan. Jungle folk do not awaken slowly. Instantly, full consciousness and full command of their every faculty returns to them from the depths of profound slumber. Even as Tarzan opened his eyes, he was upon his feet, his spear grasped firmly in his hand and ready for attack. Again was he Tarzan of the apes, sentient, vigilant, ready. No two lions have identical characteristics, nor does the same lion invariably act similarly under like circumstances. Whether it was surprise, fear, or caution which prompted the lion crouching ready to spring upon the man is immaterial. The fact remains that he did not carry out his original design. He did not spring at the man at all, but instead wheeled and sprang back into the reeds as Tarzan arose and confronted him. The ape-man shrugged his broad shoulders and looked about for his companion. Werper was nowhere to be seen. At first Tarzan suspected that the man had been seized and dragged off by another lion, but upon examination of the ground he soon discovered that the Belgian had gone away alone, out into the plain. For a moment he was puzzled, but presently came to the conclusion that Werper had been frightened by the approach of the lion, and had sneaked off in terror. A sneer touched Tarzan's lips as he pondered the man's act, the desertion of a comrade in time of danger, and without warning. Well, if that was the sort of creature Werper was, Tarzan wished nothing more of him. He had gone, and for all the ape-man cared, he might remain away. Tarzan would not search for him. 100 yards from where he stood grew a large tree, alone upon the edge of the reedy jungle. Tarzan made his way to it, clambered into it, and finding a comfortable crotch among its branches, reposed himself for uninterrupted sleep until morning. And when morning came, Tarzan slept on long after the sun had risen. His mind reverted to the primitive, was untroubled by any more serious obligations than those of providing sustenance and safeguarding his life. Therefore, there was nothing to awaken for until danger threatened or the pangs of hunger assailed. It was the latter which eventually aroused him. Opening his eyes, he stretched his giant thews, yawned, rose, and gazed about him through the leafy foliage of his retreat. Across the wasted meadowlands and fields of John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, Tarzan of the Apes looked as a stranger upon the moving figures of Bazuli and his braves as they prepared their morning meal and made ready to set out upon the expedition which Bazuli had planned after discovering the havoc and disaster which had befallen the estate of his dead master. The ape-man eyed the blacks with curiosity. In the back of his brain loitered a fleeting sense of familiarity with all that he saw, yet he could not connect any of the various forms of life, animate and inanimate, which had fallen within the range of his vision since he had emerged from the darkness of the pits of Opar with any particular event of the past. Hazily he recalled a grim and hideous form, hairy, ferocious. A vague tenderness dominated his savage sentiments as this phantom memory struggled for recognition. His mind had reverted to his childhood days. It was the figure of the giant she-ape, Kala, that he saw, but only half recognized. He saw two other grotesque man-like forms. They were of Turkos, Tublat, Kerchak, and a smaller, less ferocious figure that was Nita, the little playmate of his boyhood. Slowly, very slowly, as these visions of the past animated his lethargic memory, he came to recognize them. They took definite shape and form, adjusting themselves nicely to the various incidents of his life with which they had been intimately connected. His boyhood among the apes spread itself in a slow panorama before him, and as it unfolded it induced within him a mighty longing for the companionship of the shaggy, low-browed brutes of his past. He watched the blacks scatter their cook fire and depart, but though the face of each of them had but recently been as familiar to him as his own, they awakened within him no recollections whatsoever. When they had gone, he descended from the tree and sought food. Out upon the plain grazed numerous herds of wild ruminants. Toward a sleek, fat bunch of zebra he wormed his stealthy way. No intricate process of reasoning caused him to circle widely until he was downwind from his prey. He acted instinctively. He took advantage of every form of cover as he crawled upon all fours and often flat upon his stomach toward them. A plump young mare and a fat stallion grazed nearest to him as he neared the herd. Again it was instinct which selected the former for his meat. A low bush grew but a few yards from the unsuspecting two. The ape-man reached its shelter. He gathered his spear firmly in his grasp. Cautiously he drew his feet beneath him. In a single swift move he rose and cast his heavy weapon at the mare's side. Nor did he wait to note the effect of his assault, but leapt cat-like after his spear, his hunting knife in his hand. For an instant the two animals stood motionless. The tearing of the cruel barb into her side brought a sudden scream of pain and fright from the mare, and then they both wheeled and broke for safety. But Tarzan of the Apes, for a distance of a few yards, could equal the speed of even these, and the first stride of the mare found her overhauled, with a savage beast at her shoulder. She turned, biting and kicking at her foe. Her mate hesitated for an instant, as though about to rush to her assistance, but a backward glance revealed to him the flying heels of the balance of the herd, and with a snort and a shake of his head, he wheeled and dashed away. Clinging with one hand to the short mane of his quarry, Tarzan struck again and again with his knife at the unprotected heart. The result had, from the first, been inevitable. The mare fought bravely but hopelessly, and presently sank to the earth, her heart pierced. The ape-man placed a foot upon her carcass and raised his voice in the victory call of the Mangani. In the distance, Vasily halted as the faint notes of the hideous scream broke upon his ears. "The great apes," he said to his companion. "It has been long since I have heard them in the country of the Waziri. What could have brought them back?" Tarzan grasped his kill and dragged it to the partial seclusion of the bush which had hidden his own near approach, and there he squatted upon it, cut a huge hunk of flesh from the loin, and proceeded to satisfy his hunger with the warm and dripping meat. Attracted by the shrill screams of the mare, a pair of hyenas slunk presently into view. They trotted to a point a few yards from the gorging ape-man and halted. Tarzan looked up, bared his fighting fangs, and growled. The hyenas returned the compliment and withdrew a couple of paces. They made no move to attack, but continued to sit at a respectful distance until Tarzan had concluded his meal. After the ape-man had cut a few strips from the carcass to carry with him, he walked slowly off in the direction of the river to quench his thirst. His way lay directly toward the hyenas, nor did he alter his course because of them. With all the lordly majesty of Numa the lion, he strode straight toward the growling beasts. For a moment they held their ground, bristling and defiant, but only for a moment, and then slunk away to one side while the indifferent ape-man passed them on his lordly way. A moment later they were tearing at the remains of the zebra. Back to the reeds went Tarzan, and through them toward the river. A herd of buffaloes, startled by his approach, rose ready to charge or to fly. A great bull pawed the ground and bellowed as his bloodshot eyes discovered the intruder, but the ape-man passed across their front as though ignorant of their existence. The bull's bellowing lessened to a low rumbling. He turned and scraped a horde of flies from his side with his muzzle, cast a final glance at the ape-man, and resumed his feeding. His numerous family either followed his example or stood gazing after Tarzan in mild-eyed curiosity until the opposite reeds swallowed him from view. At the river, Tarzan drank his fill and bathed. During the heat of the day he lay up under the shade of a tree near the ruins of his burned barns. His eyes wandered out across the plain toward the forest, and a longing for the pleasures of its mysterious depths possessed his thoughts for a considerable time. With the next sun he would cross the open and enter the forest. There was no hurry. There lay before him an endless vista of tomorrows with naught to fill them but the satisfying of the appetites and caprices of the moment. The ape-man's mind was untroubled by regret for the past or aspiration for the future. He could lie at full length along a swaying branch, stretching his giant limbs and luxuriating in the blessed peace of utter thoughtlessness, without an apprehension or a worry to sap his nervous energy and rob him of his peace of mind. Recalling only dimly any other existence, the ape-man was happy. Lord Greystoke had ceased to exist. For several hours Tarzan lolled upon his swaying leafy couch until once again hunger and thirst suggested an excursion. Stretching lazily, he dropped to the ground and moved slowly toward the river. The game trail down which he walked had become by ages of use a deep, narrow trench, its walls topped on either side by impenetrable thicket and dense-growing trees closely interwoven with thick-stemmed creepers and lesser vines inextricably matted into two solid ramparts of vegetation. Tarzan had almost reached the point where the trail debouched upon the open river bottom when he saw a family of lions approaching along the path from the direction of the river. The ape-man counted 7, a male and 2 lionesses full-grown, and 4 young lions as large and quite as formidable as their parents. Tarzan halted, growling, and the lions paused, the great male in the lead baring his fangs and rumbling forth a warning roar. In his hand the ape-man held his heavy spear, but he had no intention of pitting his puny weapon against 7 lions, yet he stood there, growling and roaring, and the lions did likewise. It was purely an exhibition of jungle bluff. Each was trying to frighten off the other. Neither wished to turn back and give way, nor did either at first desire to precipitate an encounter. The lions were fed sufficiently so as not to be goaded by pangs of hunger, and as for Tarzan, he seldom ate the meat of the carnivores, but a point of ethics was at stake, and neither side wished to back down. So they stood there, facing one another, making all sorts of hideous noises, the while they hurled jungle invective back and forth. How long this bloodless duel would have persisted, it is difficult to say, though eventually Tarzan would have been forced to yield to superior numbers. There came, however, an interruption which put an end to the deadlock, and it came from Tarzan's rear. He and the lions had been making so much noise that neither could hear anything above their concerted bedlam, and so it was that Tarzan did not hear the great bulk bearing down upon him from behind until an instant before it was upon him, and then he turned to see Buto, the rhinoceros, his little pig eyes blazing, charging madly toward him, and already so close that escape seemed impossible. Yet so perfectly were mind and muscles coordinated in this unspoiled, primitive man that almost simultaneously with the sense perception of the threatened danger, he wheeled and hurled his spear at Buto's chest. It was a heavy spear shod with iron, and behind it were the giant muscles of the ape-man, while coming to meet it was the enormous weight of Buto and the momentum of his rapid rush. All that happened in the instant that Tarzan turned to meet the charge of the irascible rhinoceros might take long to tell, and yet it would have taxed the swiftest lens to record. As his spear left his hand, the ape-man was looking down upon the mighty horn lowered to toss him. So close was Buto to him. The spear entered the rhinoceros's neck at its junction with the left shoulder and passed almost entirely through the beast's body, and at the instant that he launched it, Tarzan leapt straight into the air, alighting upon Buto's back, but escaping the mighty horn. Then Buto espied the lions and bore madly down upon them, while Tarzan of the apes leapt nimbly into the tangled creepers at one side of the trail. The first lion met Buto's charge and was tossed high over the back of the maddened brute, torn and dying, and then the 6 remaining lions were upon the rhinoceros, rending and tearing the while they were being gored or trampled. From the safety of his perch, Tarzan watched the royal battle with the keenest interest, for the more intelligent of the jungle folk are interested in such encounters. They are to them what the racetrack and the prize ring, the theatre and the movies are to us. They see them often, but always they enjoy them, for no two are precisely alike. For a time it seemed to Tarzan that Buto the rhinoceros would prove victor in the gory battle. Already he had accounted for 4 of the 7 lions, and badly wounded the 3 remaining when, in a momentary lull in the encounter, he sank limply to his knees and rolled over upon his side. Tarzan's spear had done its work. It was the man-made weapon which killed the great beast that might easily have survived the assault of 7 mighty lions, for Tarzan's spear had pierced the great lungs, and Buto, with victory almost in sight, succumbed to internal hemorrhage. Then Tarzan came down from his sanctuary, and as the wounded lions, growling, dragged themselves away, the ape-man cut his spear from the body of Buto, hacked off a stake, and vanished into the jungle. The episode was over. It had been all in the day's work. Something which you and I might talk about for a lifetime, Tarzan dismissed from his mind the moment that the scene passed from his sight. Chapter 12. La seeks vengeance. Swinging back through the jungle in a wide circle, the ape-man came to the river at another point. drank and took to the trees again, and while he hunted, all oblivious of his past and careless of his future, there came through the dark jungles and the open, park-like places and across the wide meadows where grazed the countless herbivora of the mysterious continent, a weird and terrible caravan in search of him. There were 50 frightful men with hairy bodies and gnarled and crooked legs. They were armed with knives and great bludgeons, and at their head marched an almost naked woman, beautiful beyond compare. It was La of Opar, high priestess of the flaming god, and 50 of her horrid priests, searching for the purloiner of the sacred sacrificial knife. Never before had La passed beyond the crumbling outer walls of Opar, but never before had need been so insistent. The sacred knife was gone. Handed down through the countless ages, it had come to her as a heritage and an insignia of her religious office and regal authority for some long-dead progenitor of lost and forgotten Atlantis. The loss of the crown jewels or the Great Seal of England could have brought no greater consternation to a British king than did the pilfering of the sacred knife bring to La, the Oparian, queen and high priestess of the degraded remnants of the oldest civilization upon earth. When Atlantis, with all her mighty cities and her cultivated fields and her great commerce and culture and riches, sank into the sea long ages since, she took with her all but a handful of her colonists working the vast gold mines of Central Africa. From these and their degraded slaves and a later intermixture of the blood of the anthropoids sprung the gnarled men of Opar. And by some queer freak of fate, aided by natural selection, the old Atlantean strain had remained pure and undegraded in the females descended from a single princess of the royal house of Atlantis who had been in Opar at the time of the great catastrophe. Such was La. Burning with white-hot anger was the high priestess, her heart a seething, molten mass of hatred for Tarzan of the apes. The zeal of the religious fanatic whose altar has been desecrated was triply enhanced by the rage of a woman scorned. Twice had she thrown her heart at the feet of the godlike ape-man, and twice had she been repulsed. La knew that she was beautiful, and she was beautiful not by the standards of prehistoric Atlantis alone, but by those of modern times was La physically a creature of perfection. Before Tarzan came that first time to Opar, La had never seen a human male other than the grotesque and knotted men of her clan. With one of these she must mate sooner or later, that the direct line of high priestesses might not be broken, unless fate should bring other men to Opar. Before Tarzan came upon his first visit, La had no thought that such men as he existed, for she knew only her hideous little priests and the bulls of the tribe of great anthropoids that had dwelt from time immemorial in and about Opar, until they had come to be looked upon almost as equals by the Oparians. Among the legends of Opar were tales of godlike men of the olden time and of black men who had come more recently, but these latter had been enemies who killed and robbed. And too, these legends always held forth the hope that some day that nameless continent from which their race had sprung would rise once more out of the sea, and with slaves at the long sweeps would send her carven gold-picked galleys forth to succor the long-exiled colonists. The coming of Tarzan had aroused within La's breast the wild hope that at last the fulfillment of this ancient prophecy was at hand, but more strongly still had it aroused the hot fires of love in a heart that never otherwise would have known the meaning of that all-consuming passion, for such a wondrous creature as La could never have felt love for any of the repulsive priests of Opar. Custom, duty, and religious zeal might have commanded the union, but there could have been no love on La's part. She had grown to young womanhood a cold and heartless creature, a daughter of 1,000 other cold, heartless, beautiful women who had never known love. And so, when love came to her, it liberated all the pent passions of 1,000 generations, transforming La into a pulsing, throbbing volcano of desire, and with desire thwarted this great force of love and gentleness, and sacrifice was transmuted by its own fires into one of hatred and revenge. It was in a state of mind superinduced by these conditions that La led forth her jabbering company to retrieve the sacred emblem of her high office and wreak vengeance upon the author of her wrongs. To Werper she gave little thought. The fact that the knife had been in his hand when it departed from Opar brought down no thoughts of vengeance upon his head. Of course he should be slain when captured, but his death would give La no pleasure. She looked for that in the contemplated death agonies of Tarzan. He should be tortured. His should be a slow and frightful death. His punishment should be adequate to the immensity of his crime. He had wrested the sacred knife from La. He had laid sacrilegious hands upon the high priestess of the flaming god. He had desecrated the altar and the temple. For these things he should die. But he had scorned the love of La, the woman, and for this he should die horribly with great anguish. The march of La and her priests was not without its adventures. Unused were these to the ways of the jungle, since seldom did any venture forth from behind Opar's crumbling walls, yet their very numbers protected them, and so they came without fatalities far along the trail of Tarzan and Werper. 3 great apes accompanied them, and to these was delegated the business of tracking the quarry, a feat beyond the senses of the Oparians. La commanded. She arranged the order of march, she selected the camp, she set the hour for halting and the hour for resuming, and though she was inexperienced in such matters, her native intelligence was so far above that of the men or the apes that she did better than they could have done. She was a hard taskmaster, too, for she looked down with loathing and contempt upon the misshapen creatures amongst which cruel fate had thrown her, and to some extent vented upon them her dissatisfaction and her thwarted love. She made them build her a strong protection and shelter each night, and keep a great fire burning before it from dusk to dawn. When she tired of walking, they were forced to carry her upon an improvised litter, nor did one dare to question her authority or her right to such services. In fact, they did not question either. To them she was a goddess, and each loved her, and each hoped that he would be chosen as her mate. So they slaved for her, and bore the stinging lash of her displeasure, and the habitually haughty disdain of her manner, without a murmur. For many days they marched, the apes following the trail easily, and going a little distance ahead of the body of the caravan, that they might warn the others of impending danger. It was during a noonday halt, while all were lying resting after a tiresome march, that one of the apes rose suddenly and sniffed the breeze. In a low guttural he cautioned the others to silence, and a moment later was swinging quietly upwind into the jungle. La and the priest gathered silently together, the hideous little men fingering their knives and bludgeons, and awaited the return of the shaggy anthropoid. Nor had they long to wait before they saw him emerge from a leafy thicket and approach them. Straight to La he came, and in the language of the great apes, which was also the language of decadent Opar, he addressed her. "The great Tarmangani lies asleep there," he said, pointing in the direction from which he had just come. "Come, and we can kill him." "Do not kill him," commanded La in cold tones. "Bring the great Tarmangani to me alive and unhurt. The vengeance is La's. Go, but make no sound." And she waved her hands to include all her followers. Cautiously the weird party crept through the jungle in the wake of the great ape, until at last he halted them with a raised hand and pointed upward and a little ahead. There they saw the giant form of the ape-man stretched along a low bough, and even in sleep one hand grasped a stout limb, and one strong brown leg reached out and overlapped another. At ease lay Tarzan of the Apes, sleeping heavily upon a full stomach and dreaming of Numa the lion and Horta the boar and other creatures of the jungle. No intimation of danger assailed the dormant faculties of the ape-man. He saw no crouching hairy figures upon the ground beneath him, nor the 3 apes that swung quietly into the tree beside him. The first intimation of danger that came to Tarzan was the impact of 3 bodies as the 3 apes leapt upon him and hurled him to the ground, where he alighted half-stunned beneath their combined weight and was immediately set upon by the 50 hairy men, or as many of them as could swarm upon his person. Instantly the ape-man became the centre of a whirling, striking, biting maelstrom of horror. He fought nobly, but the odds against him were too great. Slowly they overcame him, though there was scarce one of them that did not feel the weight of his mighty fist or the rending of his fangs. Chapter 13. Condemned to torture and death. La had followed her company, and when she saw them clawing and biting at Tarzan, she raised her voice and cautioned them not to kill him. She saw that he was weakening, and that soon the greater numbers would prevail over him, nor had she long to wait before the mighty jungle creature lay helpless and bound at her feet. "Bring him to the palace at which we stopped," she commanded, and they carried Tarzan back to the little clearing and threw him down beneath a tree. "Build me a shelter," ordered La. "We shall stop here tonight, and tomorrow, in the face of the flaming god, La will offer up the heart of this defiler of the temple. Where is the sacred knife? Who took it from him?" But no one had seen it, and each was positive in his assurance that the sacrificial weapon had not been upon Tarzan's person when they captured him. The ape-man looked upon the menacing creatures which surrounded him and snarled his defiance. He looked upon La and smiled. In the face of death he was unafraid. "Where is the knife?" La asked him. "I do not know," replied Tarzan. "The man took it with him when he slipped away during the night. Since you are so desirous for its return, I would look for him and get it back for you, did you not hold me prisoner. But now that I am to die, I cannot get it back. Of what good was your knife anyway? You can make another. Did you follow us all this way for nothing more than a knife? Let me go and find him, and I will bring it back to you." La laughed a bitter laugh, for in her heart she knew that Tarzan's sin was greater than the purloining of the sacrificial knife of Opar. Yet, as she looked at him lying bound and helpless before her, tears rose to her eyes, so that she had to turn away to hide them. But she remained inflexible in her determination to make him pay in frightful suffering and in eventual death for daring to spurn the love of La. When the shelter was completed, La had Tarzan transferred to it. "All night I shall torture him," she muttered to her priests, "and at the first streak of dawn you may prepare the flaming altar upon which his heart shall be offered up to the flaming god. Gather wood well filled with pitch, lay it in the form and size of the altar at Opar in the centre of the clearing, that the flaming god may look down upon our handiwork and be pleased." During the balance of the day, the priests of Opar were busy erecting an altar in the centre of the clearing, and while they worked, they chanted weird hymns in the ancient tongue of that lost continent that lies at the bottom of the Atlantic. They knew not the meanings of the words they mouthed. They but repeated the ritual that had been handed down from preceptor to neophyte since the long-gone day when the ancestors of the Piltdown man still swung by their tails in the humid jungles that are England now. And in the shelter of the hut, La paced to and fro beside the stoic ape-man. Resigned to his fate was Tarzan. No hope of succor gleamed through the dead black of the death sentence hanging over him. He knew that his giant muscles could not part the many strands that bound his wrists and ankles, for he had strained often, but ineffectually for release. He had no hope of outside help, and only enemies surrounded him within the camp, and yet he smiled at Lard as she paced nervously back and forth the length of the shelter. And La. She fingered her knife and looked down upon her captive. She glared and muttered, but she did not strike. Tonight, she thought, tonight, when it is dark, I will torture him. She looked upon his perfect, godlike figure and upon his handsome, smiling face, and then she steeled her heart again by thoughts of her love spurned, by religious thoughts that damned the infidel who had desecrated the Holy of Holies, who had taken from the blood-stained altar of Opar the offering to the flaming god, and not once, but thrice. 3 times had Tarzan cheated the god of her fathers. At the thought, La paused and knelt at his side. In her hand was a sharp knife. She placed its point against the ape-man's side and pressed upon the hilt, but Tarzan only smiled and shrugged his shoulders. How beautiful he was! La bent low over him, looking into his eyes. How perfect was his figure! She compared it with those of the gnarled and knotted men from whom she most chose a mate, and La shuddered at the thought. Dusk came, and after dusk came night. A great fire blazed within the little thorn boma about the camp. The flames played upon the new altar erected in the center of the clearing, arousing in the mind of the high priestess of the flaming god a picture of the event of the coming dawn. She saw this giant and perfect form writhing amid the flames of the burning pyre. She saw those smiling lips, burned and blackened, falling away from the strong white teeth. She saw the shock of black hair tousled upon Tarzan's well-shaped head disappear in a spurt of flame. She saw these and many other frightful pictures as she stood with closed eyes and clenched fists above the object of her hate. Ah! Was it hate that La of Opar felt? The darkness of the jungle night had settled down upon the camp, relieved only by the fitful flarings of the fire that was kept up to warn off the man-eaters. Tarzan lay quietly in his bonds. He suffered from thirst and from the cutting of the tight strands about his wrists and ankles, but he made no complaint. A jungle beast was Tarzan, with the stoicism of the beast and the intelligence of man. He knew that his doom was sealed, that no supplications would avail to temper the severity of his end, and so he wasted no breath in pleadings, but waited patiently in the firm conviction that his sufferings could not endure forever. In the darkness, La stooped above him. In her hand was a sharp knife, and in her mind the determination to initiate his torture without further delay. The knife was pressed against his side, and La's face was close to his when a sudden burst of flame from new branches thrown upon the fire without lighted up the interior of the shelter. Close beneath her lips, La saw the perfect features of the forest god, and into her woman's heart welled all the great love she had felt for Tarzan since first she had seen him, and all the accumulated passion of the years that she had dreamed of him. Dagger in hand, La, the high priestess, towered above the helpless creature that had dared to violate the sanctuary of her deity. There should be no torture. There should be instant death. No longer should the defiler of the temple pollute the sight of the Lord God Almighty. A single stroke with a heavy blade, and then the corpse to the flaming pyre without. The knife arm stiffened ready for the downward plunge, and then La, the woman, collapsed weakly upon the body of the man she loved. She ran her hands in mute caress over his naked flesh. She covered his forehead, his eyes, his lips with hot kisses. She covered him with her body as though to protect him from the hideous fate she had ordained for him, and in trembling, piteous tones she begged him for his love. For hours the frenzy of her passion possessed the burning handmaiden of the flaming god, until at last sleep overpowered her and she lapsed into unconsciousness beside the man she had sworn to torture and to slay. And Tarzan, untroubled by thoughts of the future, slept peacefully in La's embrace. At the first hint of dawn, the chanting of the priests of Opar brought Tarzan to wakefulness. Initiated in low and subdued tones, the sound soon rose in volume to the open diapason of barbaric bloodlust. La stirred. Her perfect arm pressed Tarzan closer to her. A smile parted her lips, and then she awoke, and slowly the smile faded and her eyes went wide in horror as the significance of the death chant impinged upon her understanding. "Love me, Tarzan," she cried. "Love me, and you shall be saved." Tarzan's bonds hurt him. He was suffering the tortures of long-restricted circulation. With an angry growl, he rolled over with his back toward La. That was her answer. The high priestess leapt to her feet. A hot flush of shame mantled her cheek, and then she went dead white and stepped to the shelter's entrance. "Come, priests of the flaming god," she cried, "and make ready the sacrifice." The warped things advanced and entered the shelter. They laid hands upon Tarzan and bore him forth, and as they chanted they kept time with their crooked bodies, swaying to and fro to the rhythm of their song of blood and death. Behind them came La, swaying too, but not in unison with the chanted cadence. White and drawn was the face of the high priestess, white and drawn with unrequited love and hideous terror of the moments to come. Yet stern in her resolve was La. The infidel should die. The scorner of her love should pay the price upon the fiery altar. She saw them lay the perfect body there upon the rough branches. She saw the high priestess, he to whom custom would unite her, bent, crooked, gnarled, stunted, hideous, advance with the flaming torch and stand awaiting her command to apply it to the faggots surrounding the sacrificial pyre. His hairy bestial face was distorted in a yellow-fanged grin of anticipatory enjoyment. His hands were cupped to receive the life-blood of the victim, the red nectar that at Opar would have filled the golden sacrificial goblets. La approached with upraised knife, her face turned toward the rising sun, and upon her lips a prayer to the burning deity of her people. The high priest looked questioningly toward her. The brand was burning close to his hand, and the faggots lay temptingly near. Tarzan closed his eyes and awaited the end. He knew that he would suffer, for he recalled the faint memories of past burns. He knew that he would suffer and die, but he did not flinch. Death is no great adventure to the jungle-bred who walk hand in hand with the grim spectre by day and lie down at his side by night through all the years of their lives. It is doubtful that the ape-man even speculated upon what came after death. As a matter of fact, as his end approached, his mind was occupied by thoughts of the pretty pebbles he had lost, yet his every faculty still was open to what passed around him. He felt La lean over him, and he opened his eyes. He saw her white, drawn face, and he saw tears blinding her eyes. "Tarzan, my Tarzan," she moaned, "tell me that you love me, that you will return to Opar with me, and you shall live. Even in the face of the anger of my people, I will save you. This last chance I give you. What is your answer?" At the last moment, the woman-in-law had triumphed over the high priestess of a cruel cult. She saw upon the altar the only creature that ever had aroused the fires of love within her virgin breast. She saw the beast-faced fanatic who would one day be her mate, unless she found another less repulsive, standing with the burning torch ready to ignite the pyre. Yet with all her mad passion for the ape-man, she would give the word to apply the flame if Tarzan's final answer was unsatisfactory. With heaving bosom, she leaned close above him. "Yes or no?" she whispered. Through the jungle, out of the distance, came faintly a sound that brought a sudden light of hope to Tarzan's eyes. He raised his voice in a weird scream that sent La back from him a step or two. The impatient priest grumbled and switched the torch from one hand to the other at the same time, holding it closer to the tinder at the base of the pyre. "Your answer," insisted La. "What is your answer to the love of La of Opar?" Closer came the sound that had attracted Tarzan's attention, and now the others heard it. The shrill trumpeting of an elephant. As La looked wide-eyed into Tarzan's face, there to read her fate for happiness or heartbreak, she saw an expression of concern shadow his features. Now, for the first time, she guessed the meaning of Tarzan's shrill scream. He had summoned Tantor, the elephant, to his rescue. La's brows contracted in a savage scowl. "You refuse, La," she cried. "Then die." "The torch," she commanded, turning toward the priest. Tarzan looked up into her face. "Tantor is coming," he said. "I thought that he would rescue me, but I know now from his voice that he will slay me and you and all that fall in his path, searching out with the cunning of Sheeta, the panther, those who would hide from him, for Tantor is mad with the madness of love." La knew only too well the insane ferocity of a bull-elephant in must. She knew that Tarzan had not exaggerated. She knew that the devil in the cunning, cruel brain of the great beast might send it hither and thither hunting through the forest for those who escaped its first charge, or the beast might pass on without returning. No one might guess which. "I cannot love you, La," said Tarzan in a low voice. "I do not know why, for you are very beautiful. I could not go back and live in Opar, I, who have the whole broad jungle for my range. No, I cannot love you, but I cannot see you die beneath the goring tusks of mad Tantor. Cut my bonds before it is too late. Already he is almost upon us. Cut them, and I may yet save you." A little spiral of curling smoke rose from one corner of the pyre. The flames licked upward, crackling. La stood there like a beautiful statue of despair, gazing at Tarzan and at the spreading flames. In a moment they would reach out and grasp him. From the tangled forest came the sound of cracking limbs and crashing trunks. Tantor was coming down upon them, a huge juggernaut of the jungle. The priests were becoming uneasy. They cast apprehensive glances in the direction of the approaching elephant and then back at La. "Fly," she commanded them, and then she stooped and cut the bonds securing her prisoner's feet and hands. In an instant Tarzan was upon the ground. The priests screamed out their rage and disappointment. He, with the torch, took a menacing step toward La and the ape-man. "Traitor," he shrieked at the woman, "for this you too shall die." Raising his bludgeon, he rushed upon the high priestess, but Tarzan was there before her. Leaping in close quarters, the ape-man seized the upraised weapon and wrenched it from the hands of the frenzied fanatic, and then the priest closed upon him with tooth and nail. Seizing the stocky, stunted body in his mighty hands, Tarzan raised the creature high above his head, hurling him at his fellows who were now gathered ready to bear down upon their erstwhile captive. La stood proudly with ready knife behind the ape-man. No faint sign of fear marked her perfect brow. Only haughty disdain for her priests and admiration for the man she loved so hopelessly filled her thoughts. Suddenly upon this scene burst the mad bull, a huge tusker, his little eyes inflamed with insane rage. The priest stood for an instant paralyzed with terror, but Tarzan turned and gathering La in his arms raced for the nearest tree. Tantor bore down upon him, trumpeting shrilly. La clung with both white arms about the ape-man's neck. She felt him leap into the air and marveled at his strength and his ability as, burdened with her weight, he swung nimbly into the lower branches of a large tree and quickly bore her upward beyond reach of the sinuous trunk of the pachyderm. Momentarily baffled here, the huge elephant wheeled and bore down upon the hapless priests who had now scattered, terror-stricken, in every direction. The nearest he gored and threw high among the branches of a tree. One he seized in the coil of his trunk and broke upon a huge bole, dropping the mangled pulp to charge, trumpeting after another. Two he trampled beneath his huge feet, and by then the others had disappeared into the jungle. Now Tantor turned his attention once more to Tarzan, for one of the symptoms of madness is a revulsion of affection. Objects of sane love become the objects of insane hatred. Peculiar in the unwritten annals of the jungle was the proverbial love that had existed between the ape-man and the tribe of Tantor. No elephant in all the jungle would harm the Tarmangani, the white ape, but with madness of must upon him, the great bull sought to destroy his long-time playfellow. Back to the tree where Lard and Tarzan perched came Tantor the elephant. He reared up with his 4 feet against the bole and reached high toward them with his long trunk, but Tarzan had foreseen this and clambered beyond the bull's longest reach. Failure but tended to further enrage the mad creature. He bellowed and trumpeted and screamed until the earth shook to the mighty volume of his noise. He put his head against the tree and pushed, and the tree bent before his mighty strength, yet still it held. The actions of Tarzan were peculiar in the extreme. Had Numa or Sabor or Sheeta or any other beast of the jungle been seeking to destroy him, the ape-man would have danced about, hurling missiles and invectives at his assailant. He would have insulted and taunted them, reviling in the jungle Billingsgate he knew so well, but now he sat silent out of Tantor's reach, and upon his handsome face was an expression of deep sorrow and pity, for of all the jungle folk Tarzan loved Tantor the best. Could he have slain him, he would not thought of doing so. His one idea was to escape, for he knew that with the passing of the must, Tantor would be sane again, and that once more he might stretch at full length upon that mighty back and make foolish speech into those great flapping ears. Finding that the tree would not fall to his pushing, Tantor was but enraged the more. He looked up at the two perched high above him, his red-rimmed eyes blazing with insane hatred, and then he wound his trunk about the bole of the tree, spread his giant feet wide apart, and tugged to uproot the jungle giant. A huge creature was Tantor, an enormous bull in the full prime of all his stupendous strength. Mightily he strove until presently, to Tarzan's consternation, the great tree gave slowly at the roots. The ground rose in little mounds and ridges about the base of the bole. The tree tilted. In another moment it would be uprooted and fall. The ape-man whirled La to his back, and just as the tree inclined slowly in its first movement out of the perpendicular, before the sudden rush of its final collapse, he swung to the branches of a lesser neighbor. It was a long and perilous leap. La closed her eyes and shuddered, but when she opened them again she found herself safe and Tarzan whirling onward through the forest. Behind them the uprooted tree crashed heavily to the ground, carrying with it the lesser trees in its path, and then Tantor, realizing that his prey had escaped him, set up once more his hideous trumpeting, and followed at a rapid charge upon their trail. Chapter 14. A priestess, but yet a woman. At first, La closed her eyes and clung to Tarzan in terror, though she made no outcry. But presently she gained sufficient courage to look about her, to look down at the ground beneath, and even to keep her eyes open during the wide, perilous swings from tree to tree, and then there came over her a sense of safety because of her confidence in the perfect physical creature, in whose strength and nerve and agility her fate lay. Once she raised her eyes to the burning sun and murmured a prayer of thanks to her pagan god that she had not been permitted to destroy this godlike man, and her long lashes were wet with tears. A strange anomaly was Lar of Opar, a creature of circumstance torn by conflicting emotions. Now the cruel and bloodthirsty creature of a heartless god, and again a melting woman filled with compassion and tenderness. Sometimes the incarnation of jealousy and revenge, and sometimes a sobbing maiden, generous and forgiving, at once a virgin and a wanton, but always a woman. Such was Lar. She pressed her cheek close to Tarzan's shoulder. Slowly she turned her head until her hot lips were pressed against his flesh. She loved him and would gladly have died for him, yet within an hour she had been ready to plunge a knife into his heart, and might again within the coming hour. A hapless priest seeking shelter in the jungle chanced to show himself to enraged Tantor. The great beast turned to one side, bore down upon the crooked little man, snuffed him out, and then, diverted from his course, blundered away toward the south. In a few minutes even the noise of his trumpeting was lost in the distance. Tarzan dropped to the ground, and Lar slipped to her feet from his back. "Call your people together," said Tarzan. "They will kill me," replied Lar. "They will not kill you," contradicted the ape-man. "No one will kill you while Tarzan of the Apes is here. Call them and we will talk with them." La raised her voice in a weird, flute-like call that carried far into the jungle on every side. From near and far came answering shouts in the barking tones of the Oparian priests. "We come, we come." Again and again La repeated her summons until singly and in pairs the greater portion of her following approached, and halted a short distance away from the high priestess and her saviour. They came with scowling brows and threatening mien. When all had come, Tarzan addressed them. "Your La is safe," said the ape-man. "Had she slain me, she would now herself be dead, and many more of you, but she spared me that I might save her. Go your way with her back to Opar, and Tarzan will go his way into the jungle. Let there be peace always between Tarzan and La. What is your answer?" The priests grumbled and shook their heads. They spoke together, and La and Tarzan could see that they were not favourably inclined toward the proposition. They did not wish to take La back, and they did not wish to complete the sacrifice of Tarzan to the flaming god. At last the ape-man became impatient. "You will obey the commands of your queen," he said, "and go back to Opar with her, or Tarzan of the Apes will call together the other creatures of the jungle and slay you all. La saved me that I might save you and her. I have served you better alive than I could have dead. If you are not all fools, you will let me go my way in peace, and you will return to Opar with La. I know not where the sacred knife is, but you can fashion another. Had I not taken it from La, you would have slain me, and now your god must be glad that I took it, since I have saved his priestess from love-mad Tantor. Will you go back to Opar with La, promising that no harm shall befall her?" The priests gathered together in a little knot, arguing and discussing. They pounded upon their breasts with their fists. They raised their hands and eyes to their fiery god. They growled and barked among themselves until it became evident to Tarzan that one of their number was preventing the acceptance of his proposal. This was the high priest, whose heart was filled with jealous rage because La openly acknowledged her love for the stranger, when by the worldly customs of their cult she should have belonged to him. Seemingly there was to be no solution of the problem until another priest stepped forth and, raising his hand, addressed La. Kaj, the high priest," he announced, "would sacrifice you both to the flaming god. But all of us except Kaj would gladly return to Opar with our queen." "You are many against one," spoke up Tarzan. "Why should you not have your will? Go your way with La to Opar, and if Kaj interferes, slay him." The priests of Opar welcomed this suggestion with loud cries of approval. To them it appeared nothing short of divine inspiration. The influence of ages of unquestioning obedience to high priests had made it seem impossible to them to question his authority. But when they realized that they could force him to their will, they were as happy as children with new toys. They rushed forward and seized Kaj. They talked in loud, menacing tones into his ear. They threatened him with bludgeon and knife until at last he acquiesced in their demands, though sullenly, and then Tarzan stepped close before Kaj. "Priest," he said, "La goes back to her temple under the protection of her priests and the threat of Tarzan of the Apes that whoever harms her shall die. Tarzan will go again to Opar before the next rains, and if harm has befallen La, woe betide Kaj, the high priest." Sullenly, Kaj promised not to harm his queen. "Protect her," cried Tarzan to the other Oparians. "Protect her so that when Tarzan comes again, he will find La there to greet him." "La will be there to greet thee," exclaimed the high priestess, "and La will wait, longing, always longing, until you come again. Oh, tell me that you will come." "Who knows?" asked the ape-man as he swung quickly into the trees and raced off toward the east. For a moment La stood looking after him, then her head drooped, a sigh escaped her lips, and like an old woman she took up the march toward distant Opar. Through the trees raced Tarzan of the Apes until the darkness of night had settled upon the jungle. Then he lay down and slept, with no thought beyond the morrow, and with even La but the shadow of a memory within his consciousness. But a few marches to the north, Lady Greystoke looked forward to the day when her mighty lord and master should discover the crime of Achmet Zek, and be speeding to rescue and avenge, and even as she pictured the coming of John Clayton, the object of her thoughts squatted almost naked beside a fallen log, beneath which he was searching with grimy fingers for a chance beetle or a luscious grub. 2 days elapsed following the theft of the jewels before Tarzan gave them a thought. Then, as they chanced to enter his mind, he conceived a desire to play with them again, and, having nothing better to do than satisfy the first whim which possessed him, he arose and started across the plain from the forest in which he had spent the preceding day. Though no mark showed where the gems had been buried, and though the spot resembled the balance of an unbroken stretch several miles in length, where the reeds terminated at the edge of the meadowland, yet the ape-man moved with unerring precision directly to the place where he had hid his treasure. With his hunting knife he upturned the loose earth beneath which the pouch should be, but, though he excavated to a greater distance than the depth of the original hole, there was no sign of pouch or jewels. Tarzan's brow clouded as he discovered that he had been despoiled. Little or no reasoning was required to convince him of the identity of the guilty party, and with the same celerity that had marked his decision to unearth the jewels, he set out upon the trail of the thief. Though the spoor was 2 days old, and practically obliterated in many places, Tarzan followed it with comparative ease. A white man could not have followed it 20 paces 12 hours after it had been made. A black man would have lost it within the first mile. But Tarzan of the Apes had been forced in childhood to develop senses that an ordinary mortal scarce ever uses. We may note the garlic and whiskey on the breath of a fellow strap-hanger, or the cheap perfume emanating from the person of the wondrous lady sitting in front of us, and deplore the fact of our sensitive noses. But, as a matter of fact, We cannot smell at all. Our olfactory organs are practically atrophied by comparison with the development of the sense among the beasts of the wild. Where a foot is placed, an effluvium remains for a considerable time. It is beyond the range of our sensibilities, but to a creature of the lower orders, especially to the hunters and the hunted, as interesting and oft-times more lucid than is the printed page to us. Nor was Tarzan dependent alone upon his sense of smell. Vision and hearing had been brought to a marvelous state of development by the necessities of his early life, where survival itself depended almost daily upon the exercise of the keenest vigilance and the constant use of all its faculties. And so he followed the old trail of the Belgian through the forest and toward the north. But because of the age of the trail, he was constrained to a far from rapid progress. The man he followed was 2 days ahead of him when Tarzan took up the pursuit, and each day he gained upon the ape-man. The latter, however, felt not the slightest doubt as to the outcome. Some day he would overhaul his quarry. He could bide his time in peace until that day dawned. Doggedly he followed the faint spoor, pausing by day only to kill and eat, and at night only to sleep and refresh himself. Occasionally he passed parties of savage warriors, but these he gave a wide berth, for he was hunting with a purpose that was not to be distracted by the minor accidents of the trail. These parties were of the collecting hordes of the Waziri and their allies, which Bazuli had scattered his messengers broadcast to summon. They were marching to a common rendezvous in preparation for an assault upon the stronghold of Achmet Zek. But to Tarzan they were enemies. He retained no conscious memory of any friendship for the black men. It was night when he halted outside the palisaded village of the Arab raider. Perched in the branches of a great tree, he gazed down upon the life within the enclosure. To this place had the spoor led him. His quarry must be within, but how was he to find him among so many huts? Tarzan, although cognizant of his mighty powers, realized also his limitations. He knew that he could not successfully cope with great numbers in open battle. He must resort to the stealth and trickery of the wild beast if he were to succeed. Sitting in the safety of his tree, munching upon the leg of bone of Horta the boar, Tarzan waited a favourable opportunity to enter the village. For a while he gnawed at the bulging round ends of the large bone, splintering off small pieces between his strong jaws, and sucking at the delicious marrow within, but all the time he cast repeated glances into the village. He saw white-robed figures and half-naked blacks, but not once did he see one who resembled the stealer of the gems. Patiently he waited until the streets were deserted by all save the sentries at the gates, and then he dropped lightly to the ground, circled to the opposite side of the village, and approached the palisade. At his side hung a long rawhide rope, a natural and more dependable evolution from the grass rope of his childhood. Loosening this, he spread the noose upon the ground behind him, and with a quick movement of his wrist tossed the coils over one of the sharpened projections of the summit of the palisade. Drawing the noose taut, he tested the solidity of its hold. Satisfied, the ape-man ran nimbly up the vertical wall, aided by the rope which he clutched in both hands. Once at the top, it required but a moment to gather the dangling rope once more into its coils, make it fast again at his waist, take a quick glance downward within the palisade, and, assured that no one lurked directly beneath him, drop softly to the ground. Now he was within the village. Before him stretched a series of tents and native huts. The business of exploring each of them would be fraught with danger, but danger was only a natural factor of each day's life. It never appalled Tarzan. The chances appealed to him, the chances of life and death, with his prowess and his faculties pitted against those of a worthy antagonist. It was not necessary that he enter each habitation. Through a door, a window, or an open chink, his nose told him whether or not his prey lay within. For some time he found one disappointment following upon the heels of another in quick succession. No spoor of the Belgian was discernible. But at last he came to a tent where the smell of the thief was strong. Tarzan listened, his ear close to the canvas at the rear, but no sound came from within. At last he cut one of the pin ropes, raised the bottom of the canvas, and intruded his head within the interior. All was quiet and dark. Tarzan crawled cautiously within. The scent of the Belgian was strong, but it was not live scent. Even before he had examined the interior minutely, Tarzan knew that no one was within it. In one corner he found a pile of blankets and clothing scattered about, but no pouch of pretty pebbles. A careful examination of the balance of the tent revealed nothing more, at least nothing to indicate the presence of the jewels. But at the side where the blankets and clothing lay, the ape-man discovered that the tent wall had been loosened at the bottom, and presently he sensed that the Belgian had recently passed out of the tent by this avenue. Tarzan was not long in following the way that his prey had fled. The spoor led always in the shadow and at the rear of the huts and tents of the village. It was quite evident to Tarzan that the Belgian had gone alone and secretly upon his mission. Evidently he feared the inhabitants of the village, or at least his work had been of such a nature that he dared not risk detection. At the back of a native hut, the spoor led through a small hole recently cut in the brush wall and into the dark interior beyond. Fearlessly, Tarzan followed the trail. On hands and knees he crawled through the small aperture. Within the hut his nostrils were assailed by many odours, but clear and distinct among them was one that half aroused a latent memory of the past. It was the faint and delicate odour of a woman. With the cognizance of it, there rose in the breast of the ape-man a strange uneasiness, the result of an irresistible force which he was destined to become acquainted with anew, the instinct which draws the male to his mate. In the same hut was the scent spoor of the Belgian, too, and as both these assailed the nostrils of the ape-man, mingling one with the other, a jealous rage leapt and burned within him, though his memory held before the mirror of recollection no image of the she to which he had attached his desire. Like the tent he had investigated, the hut, too, was empty, and after satisfying himself that his stolen pouch was secreted nowhere within, he left, as he had entered, by the hole in the rear wall. Here he took up the spoor of the Belgium, followed it across the clearing, over the palisade, and out into the dark jungle beyond. Chapter 15. The Flight of Werper. After Werper had arranged the dummy in his bed, and sneaked out into the darkness of the village beneath the rear wall of his tent, he had gone directly to the hut in which Jane Clayton was held captive. Before the doorway squatted a black sentry. Werper approached him boldly, spoke a few words in his ear, handed him a package of tobacco, and passed into the hut. The black grinned and winked as the European disappeared within the darkness of the interior. The Belgian, being one of Achmet Zek's principal lieutenants, might naturally go where he wished within or without the village, and so the sentry had not questioned his right to enter the hut with the white woman prisoner. Within, Werper called in French and in a low whisper, "Lady Greystoke, it is I, Monsieur Frécot. Where are you?" But with no response, hastily the man felt around the interior, groping blindly through the darkness with outstretched hands. There was no one within. Werper's astonishment surpassed words. He was on the point of stepping without to question the sentry when his eyes, becoming accustomed to the dark, discovered a blotch of lesser blackness near the base of the rear wall of the hut. Examination revealed the fact that the blotch was an opening cut in the wall. It was large enough to permit the passage of his body, and, assured as he was that Lady Greystoke had passed out through the aperture in an attempt to escape the village, he lost no time in availing himself of the same avenue, but neither did he lose time in a fruitless search for Jane Clayton. His own life depended upon the chance of his eluding or outdistancing Achmet Zek, when that worthy should have discovered that he had escaped. His original plan had contemplated connivance in the escape of Lady Greystoke for two very good and sufficient reasons. The first was that by saving her he would win the gratitude of the English, and thus lessen the chance of his extradition should his identity and his crime against his superior officer be charged against him. The second reason was based upon the fact that only one direction of escape was safely open to him. He could not travel to the west because of the Belgian possessions which lay between him and the Atlantic. The south was closed to him by the feared presence of the savage ape-man he had robbed. To the north lay the friends and allies of Achmet Zek. Only toward the east, through British East Africa, lay reasonable assurance of freedom. Accompanied by a titled Englishwoman whom he had rescued from a frightful fate, and his identity vouched for by her as that of a Frenchman by the name of Frécot, he had looked forward, and not without reason, to the active assistance of the British from the moment that he came in contact with their first outpost. But now that Lady Greystoke had disappeared, though he still looked toward the east for hope, his chances were lessened, and another subsidiary design completely dashed. From the moment that he had first laid eyes upon Jane Clayton, he had nursed within his breast a secret passion for the beautiful American wife of the English lord, and when Achmet Zek's discovery of the jewels had necessitated flight, the Belgian had dreamed, in his planning, of a future in which he might convince Lady Greystoke that her husband was dead, and by playing upon her gratitude win her for himself. At that part of the village farthest from the gates, Werper discovered that 2 or 3 long poles, taken from a nearby pile which had been collected for the construction of huts, had been leaned against the top of the palisade, forming a precarious, though not impossible, avenue of escape. Rightly, he inferred that thus had Lady Greystoke found the means to scale the wall, nor did he lose even a moment in following her lead. Once in the jungle, he struck out directly eastward. A few miles south of him, Jane Clayton lay panting among the branches of a tree in which she had taken refuge from a prowling and hungry lioness. Her escape from the village had been much easier than she had anticipated. The knife which she had used to cut her way through the brush wall of the hut to freedom she had found sticking in the wall of her prison, doubtless left there by accident when a former tenant had vacated the premises. To cross the rear of the village, keeping always in the densest shadows, had required but a few moments, and the fortunate circumstance of the discovery of the hut poles lying so near the palisade had solved for her the problem of the passage of the high wall. For an hour she had followed the old game trail toward the south, until there fell upon her trained hearing the stealthy padding of a stalking beast behind her. The nearest tree gave her instant sanctuary, for she was too wise in the ways of the jungle to chance her safety for a moment after discovering that she was being hunted. Werper, with better success, travelled slowly onward until dawn, when, to his chagrin, he discovered a mounted Arab upon his trail. It was one of Achmet Zek's minions, many of whom were scattered in all directions through the forest, searching for the fugitive Belgian. Jane Clayton's escape had not yet been discovered when Achmet Zek and his searchers set forth to overhaul Werper. The only man who had seen the Belgian after his departure from his tent was the black sentry before the doorway of Lady Greystoke's prison hut, and he had been silenced by the discovery of the dead body of the man who had relieved him, the sentry that Mugambi had dispatched. The bribe-taker naturally inferred that Werper had slain his fellow and dared not admit that he had permitted him to enter the hut, fearing as he did the anger of Achmet Zek. So, as chance directed that he should be the one to discover the body of the sentry when the first alarm had been given, following Achmet Zek's discovery that Werper had outwitted him, the crafty black had dragged the dead body to the interior of a nearby tent, and himself resumed his situation before the doorway of the hut in which he still believed the woman to be. With the discovery of the Arab close behind him, the Belgian hid in the foliage of a leafy bush. Here the trail ran straight for a considerable distance, and down the shady forest aisle, beneath the overarching branches of the trees, rode with the white-robed figure of the pursuer. Nearer and nearer he came. Werper crouched closer to the ground behind the leaves of his hiding-place. Across the trail a vine moved. Werper's eyes instantly centered upon the spot. There was no wind to stir the foliage in the depths of the jungle. Again the vine moved. In the mind of the Belgian, only the presence of a sinister and malevolent force could account for the phenomenon. The man's eyes bored steadily into the screen of leaves upon the opposite side of the trail. Gradually a form took shape beyond them, a tawny form, grim and terrible, with yellow-green eyes glaring fearsomely across the narrow trail straight into his. Werper could have screamed in fright, but up the trail was coming the messenger of another death, equally sure and no less terrible. He remained silent, almost paralyzed by fear. The Arab approached. Across the trail from Werper the lion crouched for the spring, when suddenly his attention was attracted toward the horseman. The Belgian saw the massive head turn in the direction of the raider, and his heart all but ceased its beating as he awaited the result of this interruption. At a walk, the horseman approached. Would the nervous animal he rode take fright at the odour of the carnivore, and bolting leave Werper still to the mercies of the king of beasts? But he seemed unmindful of the near presence of the great cat. On he came, his neck arched, champing at the bit between his teeth. The Belgian turned his eyes again toward the lion. The beast's whole attention now seemed riveted upon the horseman. They were abreast the lion now, and still the brute did not spring. Could he be but waiting for them to pass before returning his attention to the original prey? Werper shuddered and half rose. At the same instant the lion sprang from his place of concealment, full upon the mounted man. The horse, with a shrill neigh of terror, shrank sideways almost upon the Belgian. The lion dragged the helpless Arab from his saddle, and the horse leapt back into the trail and fled away toward the west. But he did not flee alone. As the frightened beast had pressed in upon him, Werper had not been slow to note the quickly emptied saddle and the opportunity it presented. Scarcely had the lion dragged the Arab down from one side, and then the Belgian, seizing the pommel of the saddle and the horse's mane, leapt upon the horse's back from the other. A half-hour later, a naked giant, swinging easily through the lower branches of the trees, paused, and with raised head and dilating nostrils sniffed the morning air. The smell of blood fell strong upon his senses, and mingled with it the scent of Numa, the lion. The giant cocked his head upon one side and listened. From a distance up the trail came the unmistakable noises of the greedy feeding of a lion. The crunching of bones, the gulping of great pieces, the contented growling, all attested the nearness of the king at table. Tarzan approached the spot, still keeping to the branches of the trees. He made no effort to conceal his approach, and presently he had evidence that Numa had heard him, from the ominous rumbling warning that broke from a thicket beside the trail. Halting upon a low branch just above the lion, Tarzan looked down upon the grisly scene. Could this unrecognizable thing be the man he had been trailing? The ape-man wondered. From time to time he had descended to the trail and verified his judgment by the evidence of his scent that the Belgian had followed this game trail toward the east. Now he proceeded beyond the lion and his feast, again descended and examined the ground with his nose. There was no scent spoor here of the man he had been trailing. Tarzan returned to the tree. With keen eyes he searched the ground about the mutilated corpse for a sign of the missing pouch of pretty pebbles, but naught could he see of it. He scolded Numa and tried to drive the great beast away, but only angry growls rewarded his efforts. He tore small branches from a nearby limb and hurled them at his ancient enemy. Numa looked up with bared fangs, grinning hideously, but he did not rise from his kill. And then Tarzan fitted an arrow to his bow, and drawing the slim shaft far back, let drive with all the force of the tough wood that only he could bend. As the arrow sank deeply into his side, Numa leapt to his feet with a roar of mingled rage and pain. He leapt futilely at the grinning ape-man, tore at the protruding end of the shaft, and then, springing into the trail, paced back and forth beneath his tormentor. Again Tarzan loosed a swift bolt. This time the missile, aimed with care, lodged in the lion's spine. The great creature halted in its tracks and lurched awkwardly forward upon its face, paralyzed. Tarzan dropped to the trail, ran quickly to the beast's side, and drove his spear deep into the fierce heart. Then, after recovering his arrows, turned his attention to the mutilated remains of the animal's prey in the nearby thicket. The face was gone. The Arab garments aroused no doubt as to the man's identity, since he had trailed him into the Arab camp and out again, where he might easily have acquired the apparel. So sure was Tarzan that the body was that of he who had robbed him that he made no effort to verify his deductions by scent among the conglomerate odours of the great carnivore and the fresh blood of the victim. He confined his attentions to a careful search for the pouch, but nowhere upon or about the corpse was any sign of the missing article or its contents. The ape-man was disappointed, possibly not so much because of the loss of the coloured pebbles, as with Numa for robbing him of the pleasures of revenge. Wondering what could have become of his possessions, the ape-man turned slowly back along the trail in the direction from which he had